Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to rely on it to get where you're going on a regular basis. The way it's
All right, let's go ahead and begin tonight's study session. We have 2 items on the agenda. The first is a quarterly update from Bob Thompson, Chairman of the Charter Review Commission, of the Commission's recommendations on its targeted review of the City of Norman Charter. And the second item is a discussion on the Norman Transit System. So with that, we have a presentation from Bob Thompson. Thank you for chairing this committee.
Thank you.
And Catherine Walker.
Thank you. I'm going to go through each recommendation the committee or commission has made so far, and Chairman Thompson is here to provide you the context for those decisions and answer any questions you may have. I handed out these packets just a few minutes ago. And this deals with each section of the charter the committee's discussed, and it kind of covers the discussion over what may be several meetings, so it's a little bit easier to follow than flipping through multiple meeting minutes. So I've got all of that there for you, as well as the specific language that they voted on, if any. In some cases, they didn't. So the Charter Review Commission was appointed in the summer of 2019 and given a list of specific items that were requested by City Council for their review. They've held monthly meetings, open to the public, posted, all that good stuff. Quarterly public hearings were called for in the resolution, and they had their first public hearing 2 weeks ago. And then quarterly reports to City Council, so that's what we're here for tonight. The first item that the commission looked at was an amendment to Article 2, Section 1, a stipend increase for the mayor and council members. Currently, as you all know very well, you get $50 per month plus $10 for each regular or special meeting attended, no more than $100 per month. The commission discussed whether or not that was an appropriate amount and how much to raise it over at least 2 meetings, and ultimately settled on this language on the screen. And they've given you a range to work with on your recommendation. The raise would not begin until the next term, so you're not being asked to send something to the voters that affects you in your current term. And you can see there $8,100 to $11,700 for the mayor annually, and $5,400 to $7,800 annually for council members. After that point, if the voters approve that, this language would require a compensation commission be appointed to kind of take you all out of that decision making of giving yourself raises, which has kind of been what's kept it at that $100 amount all this time. So the compensation commission would meet, it would be a 5-member commission. They would set the appropriate monthly stipend for the mayor and each of the council members based on the consumer price index, the city's budget, and other relevant factors every 3 years.
Is that why it's a range?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, we didn't try to nail it down too specifically. The range comes from our understanding of the amount of time that it takes, the amount of time that council people are going to commit doing a good job, and I think we even used minimum wage. One of the primary ideas behind this range is that we'd like to see the council be a job that's accessible to people from all of our socioeconomic positions. It was pointed out by one of the people who attended the meetings in the, one of the members of the public that attended our meetings, that most, if not all, of the representatives that are on our committee, and especially those who have been council people, were either salaried individuals or self-employed people who were in a position to make time commitments without giving up any actual income, and that in having the the current arrangement where council is paid very little, that actually sort of closes it out as an option for people who are dependent on a wage. So while it would look like we're asking or we're suggesting that the pay be raised, we're actually suggesting that the pay be made more appropriate so that it's more people have access to the position.
I completely agree. I'm just curious about the 8,100 / 11,000. Like, why is there a range, not just a recommended amount?
Well, we didn't we didn't believe that we could come to a specific agreement on an amount. We were trying to come to, well, we thought it'd be easier to reach an agreement on our committee as a range, and then the council probably could choose a dollar amount in that range. If you were gonna actually send it forward, then the council could sort of sharpen that pencil and get the right number, the number that they felt like was appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to also add, having been on council, one of the things that we thought was really important here was to try to insert a method for keeping the pay current as a matter of course. I'm aware that it's quite often suggested that the council's pay is inadequate, and yet the council never wants to be in a position where they're giving themselves a raise or even giving the job a raise. We feel like that's a mistake on part of our, those of us who have served, and so we tried to put in a mechanism that would, if we can get the city council now to put this in front of the voters, that it'll be a benefit to the city over a very long range, because it'll be a one and done, and the keeping it current won't be a matter of political courage, it'll be a matter of process. And so we think that the dollar amount is somewhat important, but the process itself is even more important to put this in front of the voters and give us all a way to keep our council adequately paid without it being a political issue.
I agree.
The next item was an amendment to the same section to consider reimbursement for cell phone expenses. Currently, the charter does not address cell phones at all. And the committee discussed this and ultimately decided they didn't feel like this was something that should be in the charter, but it would be a positive policy change for the city to consider. And so no language is recommended here. Article 2, Section 2, the expiration of the terms. And this language ended up dealing with both how long the terms are and when you take office. Currently, as you know, council members serve 2-year terms, with the odd wards elected in odd-numbered years, even wards elected in even-numbered years, and the mayor serves a 3-year term. And you all take office the first Tuesday in July after the election. The committee discussed both the lead time between when you're elected and when you actually get seated. That's a pretty long period, and at one time we did have a quicker seating process, and we changed back to this language that we have now. But the committee discussed, whether or not that was really working, and then they also discussed the length of the terms. And so the recommendation, and again here with the years, we're trying not to impact any current terms or terms that will be up for election this year, knowing that it would take a while to get this on a ballot. So beginning in 2023, the recommendation is to move to 3-year terms for council members. And in 2024, terms begin on the first Tuesday following certification of the election results. And I think this is an approach followed in Stillwater and Edmond, I think.
So.
Were some of the cities we looked at. And it's a quick turnaround, but it also, depending on the election date and whether or not there was a runoff, would get a council member in, at the beginning of the budget cycle instead of inheriting a budget you didn't participate in necessarily. So this is the language. It's lengthy, and it's on your sheet. And you can see the chart that I provided in the materials to kind of show how the dates work out, so that, again, we're looking ahead at future terms and not impacting any current terms. The CRC voted 6-5 to move forward with this proposal in November. So beginning with the 2025 election, the mayor's term would begin following on the first Tuesday following certification of the election results. And council members, it would begin in 2023 for odd-numbered wards and 2024 for even-numbered wards.
So no term extension for mayor.
No, 3 years for all.
And it'd be 3-year terms for each one. This was a topic that if you notice the 6-5 vote,
Yeah.
it was tight.
What were the dissenting votes, reasons?
Well,
Not change at all, or they wanted
no,
something
no
different?
change at all. I think that there's a strong sentiment that you shouldn't fix something that's already working. I would say that that's probably the strength of the sentiment behind the 5 people who preferred to keep it as it is. There is a certain mathematical beauty to the fact that the mayor always runs with either the odds or the evens, that there's a rotation, and that and of course we're all used to it, and if there's not a problem with it, you may not want to change it. Then there were those of us who felt like there were some advantages to changing that made it worthwhile. One of the things that we tried to address with the 3-year term was to give council members a little longer term without it being too long of a term, but a long enough term so that you're not turning around and having to run for re-election virtually as soon as you get elected. We also recognize that for new council members, it's quite often 2 years before you feel like you're really in step with not just what's going on at the city, but what's going on with the rest of your fellow council members.
Councilmember Scott?
So in the cases of basically an uncontested election, when would the new counselor take office?
The election board secretary certifies those results after the general election for that
So the
ward.
February.
So it'd be February.
Okay, thank you.
I need to say one more thing. We wanted to be faithful to the 5 people who were dissenting on the 3-year terms. When we made our presentation to the public, we did feel like this was one of the subjects that the public had the most reaction to. It wasn't a favorable reaction.
Really?
I think, again, it's not broke, so why fix it? But I don't think any of us had anticipated that it would be reacted to that way, and so when we discussed after having made the presentation, one of the things that we wanted to be sure that you all knew was that was probably one of the topics that drew the most commentary from the public.
Councilmember Hall?
I'm just curious what the thinking was behind not extending the mayor's term and keeping that the same as the councilors.
I think that if I understand right, the mathematics of it is probably the primary thought, and one of the advantages of having 3 separate cycles is that any councilman, when there is a election for mayor, this would leave all council members in a position where they could run for mayor without having to yield their seat. Instead of, say, if you happen to be an odd person in an even year, you have the opportunity, but the even person in the even year doesn't have the opportunity to run for mayor at that time, or at least it makes the political risk, typically not a good calculation. So, so that the multiples of 3 mathematically worked, and it also gave us an election a citywide election that is simply about the mayor, when we felt like there was some advantage to that as well.
Go ahead, Councilmember Hall.
So then the other thing I was just curious about is, so we would still stay in the February election cycle. Is that our choice, or is that mandated by the state?
This, under state law, the Let the Troops Vote Act, we have limited dates
That's
in
what
which
I
we
was
can
my
have
understanding.
elections.
Yeah.
So in order to have a general election for the wards and the mayor, and then an opportunity for a runoff, it's typically been February and April.
Okay. So the way that would work is, so if you were elected in February, you would take office immediately,
Right, the Tuesday following certification of the results.
So there is a scenario that some city councilors could take office in February, but there might be other wards that would be waiting till April because there's a runoff, and that's just the way it would work. Okay, just to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Councilmember Carter?
Did the committee discuss, I guess, to me, the pro and the con of seating them at a different time versus the first Tuesday of July is the budget process? Because that's when that's happening. And I just wondered if there were any thoughts or discussions regarding, a new council member being seated in February, immediately diving into the budget process versus the seasoned person finishing that budget process, since the fiscal year starts on July 1.
Okay, so this is, I'm going to editorialize, but I'll look to you for support. Okay. I think that was probably why we do things now, is that I think that some time ago, the protest was that I've been elected and immediately I have to sign off on a budget that I had no participation in. And so there was an attempt to give a stretch of time where a newly elected official has the opportunity to work with that budget. I think that the determination is that that hasn't been as advantageous as it has been problematic and sometimes confusing, especially for people who think that they have elected a new council person in February, and between February and July, that person is in some sort of a limbo. I can tell you, when I was in that position, that there was a good question as to whether I should have even been involved in any executive sessions because I wasn't sworn in and I wasn't required to be there. There's a question about how much you're actually able to be involved at that time. And so the amount of time that it's turned into a large gap between the election day and the swearing in. And so I think that the committee just generally concluded that that had not really solved a lot of problems and had created some more problems, and it would be more understandable to the public if we just go to something that's...
I wondered about the history of it, if they had been a format like what you're recommending, and then they changed, went to the current format, or they were in the current format and they went to the other one and they changed back, if it was all about the budget, or what were the other factors in those decisions?
Our prior charter language didn't seat the elected council member quite this quickly. I think it was in
April. After
right.
the runoff.
So everyone would start in April, and then you are in the middle of the budget. You really are stepping in at an
So was the
difficult
reason they
time.
thought they changed back to the current was because of the budget?
I think that was part of it, yeah, and just having to step right into that so quickly mid-process.
I can understand that.
Councilmember Holman?
When we revised this a few years ago, it was because as mentioned, the change in the state law, and February is the only month where we could have our city elections be the same month every year, so that voters could say, okay, city council elections in Norman are always going to be the same month every year. And February was the only month we could do it. We could do it in April, but if we do it in April, the runoff in every other year wouldn't be until September, which would be 2 months after you would be supposed to be sworn in. Because we can't have a municipal election every June, and we can't have municipal elections every November. I hear that all the time. Why doesn't the city have elections when the presidential and the governor? Well, first, those are only every 4 years. And we elect city council every 2 years, as we've mentioned. And even this wouldn't change that. That'd still be only every 3 years. So February is the only month where we could have city council and mayoral elections be the same month every year, and the runoff be just 2 months later in April. My personal preference would be that our city council elections would be in April with a runoff in May, and then seated in July. Because when I first got elected in 2013, it was April 2nd, and I got sworn in the first Tuesday in July. So that gave me a couple months to go visit all the city facilities, talk with everybody, get kind of my feet underneath me, and I appreciated that time. But I know we've had council members that have had elections in February or April,
Presidents got
and then
sworn in faster
get
than I
well,
did, Stephen.
and then you're sworn in, or you get elected, and then you're sworn in a week later. You get elected at the end of
Had both.
June, and then you're sworn in the next week, and so we've had it both ways. So.
Now, why can't we do the May runoff? Why is that?
You're
State
limited, you're limited on, when you can hold elections under state statute. So you're very limited in even numbered years. You're tied to a lot of the dates that are already established for, your state elections and your national elections. In odd number years, you can have an election any month but December. And in even numbered years, you can only have elections on like 5 different months. And so, as Stephen was saying, the only months that were consistent that you could have them every year were February and April, unless you went to a September, November thing or something like that.
Yeah.
They didn't mean one
Yeah,
would be
unless we
September.
went to a different swear-in where you had them in the fall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just do it online.
And I think February elections and then council members getting sworn in the following week is definitely early enough, I think, in the budget process where, we're not voting on that until June. But I think April kind of pushes it. If you go to a runoff and then you don't get sworn in until the middle of April, and then you're going to vote on a, $250 million budget at the beginning of June. So I think that maybe not problematic. I mean, adults can learn how to do stuff pretty quickly usually. And especially if you're running for this seat and serious about getting elected, you should probably already be on top of all those things. But my other question, or real question though, is with the mayor and council members all being 3 years, how would that, wouldn't there be one set of council members who always run with the mayor election?
We'd
I'm
have
just not
the,
seeing-
we'd have the odd wards run 1 year. We'd have the mayor run,
Oh, heck yeah, I'm thinking 3 and 3. Okay, so yeah, right, there's
So-
2 sets of,
2023 for odd wards would be the beginning, under this language of 3-year terms. 2024 for even wards, 2025
okay.
for the mayoral, which lines up
Okay.
uh, with the next, end of the next term, I guess. But
Okay.
All right, Councilmember Bierman?
Well, I had a very similar experience to Mayor Clark in being elected in February and not getting sworn in until July, and it feels like a lifetime, and no one understands it. And that is just, have to say over and over again, nope, not in the seat, not in the seat. And
That's
you
way
kind
too
of
long.
touched on it, Councilmember Holman, at the very end of your point, which is that if you are running for this seat and you are in a runoff, if you are not paying attention to what's going on with the budget process, I don't think that bodes very well for you in your runoff, because if you can't demonstrate your seriousness for this seat by acting like you're in it when you're running for the seat, then I don't see why someone is doing this. So while I'm sensitive to that, I do think that we can hopefully just encourage more people to pay attention
The
faster.
motivating factor. You better know what you're
Yeah,
doing
because you're not getting the guarantee of 6 months to be
Right,
able to get
to
caught
get
up.
into it, yeah.
So, what kind of pressure, though? What does staff see as changes to orientation because of this? I mean,
Would
can
be-
you pack that in so fast? Would you want to? Do you? I mean, would you
we
offer
leave
it
that up
as a
to-
campaign offer? Like, anyone who's running can come in and do this tour.
It's happened before when we used to have the June runoffs. I mean, Bria was one of those that
Oh,
got sworn in
crazy.
the very
That's
next
true.
Tuesday. So that short window
Yeah.
has happened, and it's.
I've had
I
both.
mean, we can deal with it. With orientations, we kind of work with the candidate, what their schedule will allow. They can get it all really fast, or they can spread it out. And of course, we would try to do the really critical ones quickly before they're swearing in, if possible. But it wouldn't be undoable.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
the next section was Article 2, Section 10, resignation upon filing for another elected office. The charter doesn't currently require one to resign upon filing for another elected office, and the Charter Commission discussed whether they should be, and ultimately recommended no change to the charter. Article 2, Section 2, residency in the ward for a minimum of 6 months. In order to be a candidate, currently you have to reside in the ward at the date you file for election, and of course, once you're elected, but you just have to live in Norman for the 6 months prior to the election. And so the Charter Commission discussed whether or not that should be changed to require 6 months within the ward. And I think,
Councilor Hall, is your hand up?
Yes.
Okay.
Just curious as to the conversation and the thinking behind arriving at no changes recommended.
they actually, if you look in your packet, I apologize, there's an error in the slide. They did recommend language for this, and it was to require that they reside within the ward for which they seek election for 6 months prior to the date of the election. And if the ward designation changes in the 6 months prior to the election due to reapportionment, then that durational residency requirement would be waived, although they would have to live in those newly established boundaries.
So that slide is completely wrong.
Right, it's in your packet.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, got it.
Partisan elections, Article 2, Section 11, our charter currently says that we have nonpartisan elections, and the Charter Review Commission pretty quickly recommended no changes to this. They were not interested in partisan elections.
Councilor Patron.
So just so I'm understanding, basically the one prior, not this one, on the residing in the ward, are we really just going off of where they're registered to vote, not really where they're residing, or do we actually have a definition for reside?
We don't. We talked about that. What is residence? And it would be probably based on their voter registration. In the background materials, I included some definitions. Case law that's looked at the term residence. Black's Law Dictionary defines it as a living or dwelling in a certain place permanently or for a considerable length of time. So on its face, this language would require that you live or dwell in a location within that ward for 6 months. Domicile is the place at which a person is physically present and the person regards as home. But of course, the things you have that show your residence are your voter registration, utility bills, things like that.
So, Paula, would it be fair to say that the Charter Review Commission felt like that would be a policy definition that we would want to flesh out if there were changes to be made?
I think so. I think that we try to keep in mind, and this kind of goes back to your question about a range for salaries. We tried to keep in mind that we're a recommending body, and that ultimately we assume that if you take our recommendations, you're still going to fine-tune them and change them to your liking. So we didn't try to produce, the perfect language for the recommendations.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Bierman.
So I have knocked doors for myself and other people, and I more than once have been led to a business that someone is registered to vote at. So I don't know if anyone here can speak to what the election board does to ensure that someone's registered to vote at a dwelling place and not a business, but clearly some slip through the cracks, and whether or not that's just law of averages or they're just not checking it. What do we do to ensure that the place that they are registered to vote is an actual residence?
That's what the contest period is for. After they filed, when you sign a declaration of candidacy, you are taking an oath that says that all of these things that you've listed here are true and correct. So if somebody determines that the address you've had is a business or that you're not living there, that would be something that they could contest in that 3-day period with the election board. They do not check every address that somebody puts on a registration to see what that is. I mean, you take some of that responsibility on yourself when you sign up, so, but that is exactly what that contest period is for things like that.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that there are multiple ways to prevent this from happening. So that way someone,
Yes.
during the contest period, if someone does contest that, they then can't point to this ordinance and say, no, I have followed the letter of
No,
the
I mean,
charter.
they have to, I mean, it's a penalty of perjury if they put something on that form that's not accurate.
Okay, so they have to sign that form that says that they live there, not just, yes,
Declaration
this
of
is my
candidacy.
accurate voter registration address.
It says it at
Okay.
the bottom of that form, the Declaration of Candidacy.
Okay.
Any questions on partisan elections? Okay. Article 2, Section 22, this is the language that deals with how we fill vacant council positions. Currently, the charter requires that they must be filled by a majority vote of the remaining members of council. But if council does not fill that vacancy within 60 days, council is required to call a special election to fill the vacancy for the unexpired term. The committee talked through how, the different ways we've filled vacancies through the years. We've gone from, tie votes on the dais to drawing a name out of a hat, to more recently appointing committees made up of ward residents. And so that is the language that the Charter Commission ultimately adopted. So vacancies in office would be filled by a majority vote of the remaining members of council after appointment and recommendation of one candidate from a selection committee made up of 5 residents of the ward. And so still, if it's not filled within 60 days, you're required to call a special election. So that way, you still have that option if for whatever reason you can't get that committee appointed or you can't settle on the candidate. This committee would be appointed like everything else in the city. That's provided for in our ordinances. Appointments by the mayor, but with the consent of council.
So it formalizes what we've been doing. Perfect.
Article 7, Section 2, appointment and removal of the city attorney by city council. Currently, the city attorney is appointed by the city manager, subject to the approval of a majority of city council, and can only be removed by the city manager. The Charter Review Commission looked at a couple of different options here and ultimately decided to model that language for the city attorney appointment after the city manager appointment language. So you see that language is word for word with the exception of city attorney versus city manager. The position would become an at-will position appointed by a majority of council and subject to removal with 5 votes of council. I put the language on a separate slide because it's quite wordy, but that does mirror exactly what the city manager section says for
So
appointment
essentially
and removal.
we have one employee that we can hire and fire.
Get 2.
We have two.
You'd have 2 now.
What would the hiring look like? Same?
Same
Probably
process.
the same process.
Yeah, it doesn't call that out, just that, chosen on the basis of qualifications without regard to age, race, color, religion, etc.
Any questions?
They also discussed creating the position of city auditor, subject to appointment and removal of city council. This was discussed as a possible independent auditing source that could be a full-time employee of the city, hired and fired by council. We don't currently have that position at all and not within the charter. And the committee ultimately recommended no changes to the charter.
Councilmember Hall.
Again, just interested in what the thinking was of the commissioners.
This was a difficult one for us to discuss at length because we weren't real clear on what the council intended as the role of an auditor. I'd say this is one of a few questions that we had or a few items that we had from the council where we probably would have benefited from a little bit more specific description of what the council people had in mind that submitted this as an issue. Whether, I think one of the questions was whether it would be an additional role at the city or whether it would replace a role at the city. I think we just didn't have really enough certainty about what was intended and this brings me to a point that I have in my notes that I wanted everybody here to be aware of, and I really want to commend Catherine for her presentation. She was very good about doing her best to present what the council was trying to put in front of us without doing editorializing of her own. And that prompts a really good conversation on our part. It gives us lots of room to have good conversation. And we appreciated that. But in this kind of a situation where the questions were vague or just not real specific, it left us kind of wondering what we should talk about. I hope that makes sense to you guys.
Councilmember Patron?
So did you all discuss whether or not it would be appropriate if council wanted to hire an auditor, you know, an auditor that answers to the council on budgeting, whether or not that would be something that would be, I don't know, okay, prudent?
We didn't discuss whether we thought that would be appropriate. I think that we came to the conclusion on several of these items. I'd say with the Bill of Rights, with the auditor, probably with the ethics question, that those might be topics that the council would fine-tune, maybe with some committee work, so that they could present to the commission maybe a specific proposal or a job description, or give us some idea of what they're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Basically just needed more info on that one.
Yeah, I think that's the case. We couldn't be sure based on the language we had in front of us what the role of the auditor was going to be.
Councilmember Hall?
So in the future, if I'm hearing what you're saying, it would be desirable from your point of view to have a much more narrow and specific question or recommendation than to have it as broad as something like this, that you just need a more narrow place to make these decisions.
It would have been helpful in some of those situations, and we also recognize that some of the requests came in, or some of the items came in rather late and in a hurried way, and so we try to give them the due respect, but it's hard to make a recommendation about something that's stated broadly. We can't be sure we're all talking about the thing that's on your mind.
And the commission did talk about, how does this role fit in with the outside audits we already do? And so I think that's where they were kind of struggling with what would this do that's different from the outside audits.
Councilmember Scott?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I saw an auditor position in the open positions from the meeting last Thursday, no?
There was an auditor position added to the budget last year, but not continued or never advertised before.
Okay, so that's what I had thought, so if we did hire an auditor, it would just be under the jurisdiction of the city manager, one of our
And
employees.
that was the question before the charter committee, was who we would report to.
Instead of the city council, it
so
would remain under
we didn't know that.
City manager, like any other staff person. So that makes sense to me. And then that's all, the comment I have on that. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
The committee also discussed the question of whether or not consequences should be added to the charter for violation of the city's ethics ordinance. The city's ethics ordinance is adopted by ordinance, not charter, in section 2 of the code. And the committee discussed this and what consequences there might be available, and decided to recommend no changes or additions to the current charter.
Raise your hand. Councilmember Scott?
Did we skip the appointment and removal of city attorney? Are we coming back to that?
We already covered.
We covered that?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I guess I was not paying attention, but is this one that the charter committee had wanted to adopt and make the city attorney directly under the city council. Okay, so I guess this makes me a little uncomfortable, just because, you know, talking about at-will employees and being a right-to-work state, I just feel like it's just kind of problematic, you know, a sort of lack of job security. It would make me very uncomfortable because you may have a council that just decides they don't like the work that an attorney is doing. So I don't know, I guess this will go to the vote of the people anyway, but those are my 2 cents on that. Just makes me kind of uncomfortable. I don't like not having protections for our employees.
Okay, thank you.
In the last couple of meetings, the commission's discussed an addition of a community bill of rights. What is that? You know, how would that look? And at this time, they're making no recommendation for changes or additions to the charter. Although this is one where, as Chairman Thompson discussed, they talked about how this might be something that would be more appropriate for its own standalone committee if it's something council wanted to pursue. It's a pretty big topic, and there's a lot of information out there, and I think it was unclear to the commission, you know, what this achieves, and so I think the thought was it might be more appropriate for a separate committee.
Okay.
And then I think this is the last item that the commission's voted on, but they were asked to consider whether a vote of the electorate should be required for TIFs. It was a robust discussion and ultimately a split vote on a proposal that would require voter approval of tax increment financing districts or amendments thereto that pledge sales tax increments. And that was just just a couple weeks ago. I think we voted on that, so.
We had a very spirited conversation on this one. And probably with the exception of that particular meeting, we had enjoyed almost 100% attendance. That one is, in the middle of the winter, we only had, I think, 10 people. Mm-hmm. So we wound up with a 5-5 tie. And the remark was made because we spent quite a bit of time talking about it, and one of the committee members remarked that, being a 5-5 tie, that was a waste of time. And one of the other committee members made the great point that we are ultimately a recommending body to the council. So we wound up with a really good quality discussion. We had people who truly disagreed with each other that were able to have that conversation with a good level of intensity without anybody getting angry. And if you want to see what the committee really thinks and maybe have a broader idea of what our discussions were, the minutes should provide you with a lot of good information. If you want to take it up and talk it over amongst yourselves, it'll be a good body of work.
Councilmember Carter?
Would you mind summarizing the two compelling arguments on each side just briefly?
I'd be happy to. There were those who feel like the current difficulties we have with the University North Park TIF is overshadowing and painting with a broad brush the value of TIFs in general. And so they felt like it was bad judgment to maybe put too much pressure or too much weight on a public vote regarding TIFs just because we're having difficulty with a particular TIF. To that group of people, a TIF is an important tool for economic development, and the thought that economic development as as a strategy would take a serious hit in our town if we were too restrictive on the passing of a TIF, that would be a mistake. And so the idea of making public vote for every TIF, by the way, we did decide to editorial or edit your input a little bit, that we decided that if we were going to have a public vote on TIFs, it would be on all TIFs instead of all TIFs over a certain amount, just because couldn't find a good rationale for where that line should be. But people who are not in favor of a public vote on the TIFs were primarily trying to defend the validity and the ease of access that comes along with the TIF in terms of economic development. The people who were interested in putting a TIF to a public vote probably come from it very much the same way, that while it might be an important tool, it's not the only tool. Typically it's a large amount of money, and it's instituted for a very long period of time, 25 years in the case of University of North Park, and I think that's the limit in the state. And so the thinking on the part of those who were more favorable to a public vote was that something that large falls in the category of an increase in sales tax or a general obligation bond, that it has a large and long-range impact on the community, and that in order to make sure that we exercise good judgment, the entire community should be brought into play like they are for those other taxes. The further argument was that if we require a public vote, then people who are proposing a TIF would have to really be committed to being something the entire public was favorable to, and they'd have to perform for the entire public instead of just for a simple majority of the council.
Any follow-up, Councilmember? Okay, Councilmember Scott?
This would only apply to TIFs that pledge sales tax. It's not every TIF.
That's correct. That's correct, because we were really concerned about the TIFs that impacted
The general
the
fund.
Treasury.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Okay, so these are the items remaining to be considered. The section dealing with utility rates requiring council to consider a resolution calling for a vote of the electorate to increase city utility rates under certain conditions. This is a little bit different from what other charter review commissions have considered. Rather than just striking that requirement, this is a requirement that would require council to call a vote in certain situations to make sure the utility rates keep up with the need. Article 6, Section 1, increasing the number of members of the Norman Regional Hospital Authority from 9 to 11. We started at the last meeting and will continue issues related to the Open Meeting Act, potential loopholes, executive session restrictions, and whether or not the committee wants to provide a recommendation on those issues. Revisiting the relationship between the hospital and the city for equitability of benefit versus burden to the respective parties, and then examining the ward boundary creation process. This is the reapportionment process that will be coming into play as the census gets underway and is finalized.
Next year.
So, with that, any questions for us?
Councilmember Hall?
So what is the timeline for the items remaining to be considered?
The resolution says that they have to be done within a year, but they can ask for an extension. They've been really productive, so I think it'll get done within the year.
And then, so what is the process with the ones that have already been considered?
It's up to you all. What we've done in the past is at the end of the Charter Review Commission process, they will bring that whole package to you. We'll have a public hearing, and then you'll be required to vote on each item separately, whether or not you want to send it to a vote. And we've typically put those all on one ballot.
Councilmember Patron?
I know I've had other people that have asked me about things that they would like to pass along. Would you all be open to taking more questions if you're moving along as quickly as you are?
I sure am. We're enjoying the process. I think that we have a really good committee that's got a good amount of trust in each other, and
That's awesome.
the meetings are, like she said, very productive. We'd be happy to look at whatever the council would like us to look at. If some of the questions that we've made no recommendation on, if you guys would like to get more specific about what you hope for us to talk about, I'm happy to have those back on the agenda.
Okay, Councilmember Bierman?
What's the most charter changes we've ever had on a single ballot?
20.
I don't know, it was a lot.
20?
Yeah.
20 or 26. I said that really fast. But we had a bunch one time.
Was it an election just for that? It was? Okay. Because I was a little worried about if we have a lot of fairly substantive. I mean, were they all substantive? I'm like, I just can't imagine going through a ballot of 20 or 26 really meaty changes to the charter that might have some really long-term implications for this city and not getting exhausted after 5.
Well, sometimes, some of them are cleanup. The way we've always handled them in the past, before council started this targeted review process, is a commission would get appointed and they would be charged with going through the entire charter. And so a lot of times there would be tweaks here and there, just cleaning up language, not big changes to how their government worked. And so those where we had a lot on one ballot were full charter reviews.
Okay. Because I am a little concerned about them all being on one ballot if we have a lot of substantive changes and additions mostly. I think it's not just tweaking language here or there. I mean, I don't know what of those final ones you're going to come to any actionable recommendation on. I don't know what percentage of that we're going to want to move forward with, but even if there are, I would say more than 5 or 6 really substantive ones, we might want to consider splitting those up or doing one special charter election and really spending the time to make sure that all the information is out there ahead of time. I'm just concerned about the length of the ballot and voter fatigue as they get down ballot.
Thank you. Councilmember Scott?
Follow up to Councilmember Patron's question. If we want to send something back to the committee, does it need to go through another vote, or is that what?
Since we've added everything by resolution, I would recommend amending that resolution to add additional.
Okay. So
To be consistent.
with that said, since some of these are already on there, like if we wanted to add a new thing, that's one thing, I would amend the resolution. But if we wanted to send back like the ones that bother me, for example, that don't have a recommendation, or the ethics violation, if there's no penalty for if a council member violates ethics, which I think is, I don't know, I think there should be some sort of 3 strikes rule or public shame or something like that. Yeah, something, shame on you, something like that, like, I don't know. But maybe reconsider that, because I think we should be held accountable for any unethical decisions made. And then also, again, back to the city attorney being completely under the, I'm gonna say jurisdiction again of the city council. I think that maybe amending that to say instead of a vote of 5 members of the council, it should be 6, so a supermajority. I just think that adds a little bit more protection to the position.
Okay.
I would ask you, I happen to agree with you on quite a bit of that. It would be helpful to us. There were plenty of us who thought that there should be a consequence for ethics, and I don't want it to be misconstrued that we looked at that and said, nah, it's not important. We are probably not going to have a successful discussion that is broadly about should there be consequences. So if we have an idea of what kinds of consequences you're interested in, or what you think ought to be either an outcome or a process for us to discuss, that would be good. And then if you just think there should be, maybe there are 1 or 2 bright line issues that most ethics are a matter of personal judgment, but there are some ethics that may need to be institutionally bound by the charter, maybe. And this is something that always gets discussed, whether or not, if my company has got an issue in front of the city, am I required to recuse? If I have a contract with a company, when I was on city council, I had a contract with the county, and they wanted me to vote on the county jail in spite of the fact that I happily recused myself, and I actually came under some pressure from those folks to vote. They wanted a unanimous vote. They wanted the community to know that it was unanimous, and they didn't want me to recuse. I felt like I should recuse, and it would have been helpful for me if the charter required a recusal. That protects me as a council member. It doesn't challenge my sense of my own integrity, but it protects the integrity of the council as a body. We didn't have those kinds of things that we could be sure we were discussing that were on your mind, but we would love to discuss those things.
I think a requirement to recuse yourself if your company or your business, I don't own a business, but if my company Dell comes before the council for a contract, it's appropriate for me to recuse myself. And then, I don't think it's appropriate to promote any kind of business. I think that's a conflict of interest, especially if you're the business owner on the council. And so I think at the very least, we should consider required recusal if that happens, and then also if there is a direct conflict of interest, there should be a process to, again, take away pay for one of the $50 stipend for a week or something,
Rich people on council can get away with stuff.
Sorry, Stephen. Or sorry.
That's what that
I'm
means.
just trying to work it out. Some sort of, maybe not the $50. Give them their $30 after taxes, but or make them unable to vote on the next. I don't know.
I would say
suspend them.
I would say that what you've got there is maybe you may be talking about a couple of different types of ethics, where a person's personal judgment is a matter of ethics. It becomes very difficult for the group to say, well, I think that was unethical of you. But if you have some institutionalized ethics that it's agreed on, and we already do this on council, you already do this on council, where it's not called a matter of ethics, but the manager's employees are the manager's employees, not yours. And so it's well known and understood that you don't tell any of his employees what to do. It doesn't necessarily say what the consequences are, but it's a very bright line that you don't cross. And if I would this is just my personal opinion, I think those kinds of ethical considerations being institutionalized makes for a more trustworthy council by the public, public that can be sure that their council's not in a position to get out of line.
I appreciate it. I think that all politicians and people who are in this line of work, bureaucrats, whatever, they are subject to ethical drift. We have to constantly keep ourselves in check, and if we're not, others need to hold us accountable. So I would just like for you all to consider some things, because I'm not coming up with the best stuff right now. But just consider.
We'll be happy
some
to consider whatever you put in front of us.
Cast them out of the city.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Holman.
This wasn't a topic that the council 2-3 years ago spent quite a bit of time discussing, and we could not come to any agreement about how ethics violations should be administered or who would do it. We came to some sort of conclusion that it could definitely be used as a sword by council members against other council members.
Has been.
And has been.
That's what I'm worried about.
Yes, and being an employee of a business does not mean you have a conflict of interest directly or indirectly. And I think excluding anybody who has a job from voting on something could impact negatively the residents of that ward. So basically, if you have a certain type of job, like former Ward 4 council member Greg Youngman had to recuse all the time, because I mean, he worked for HUD, and HUD contracts came in front of the city. I'm not sure that his position was directly impacted by that, but he had to recuse a lot. And that impacted the voice of the Ward 4 residents, in my opinion, on really important development projects sometimes. And I think one of the issues that we went over a lot too was endorsements of political candidates. So under the old rules, technically a Norman City Council member could not endorse any candidate running for any office anywhere. You could not endorse somebody running for president. If you said City Council member Stephen Holman is voting for Bernie Sanders, that could be an ethics violation under the old rules. And there was an instance where Mayor Rosenthal's name appeared on a campaign flyer for the chief of the Cherokee Nation, an event in Tulsa, and someone filed an ethics complaint against her over that, and it was drawn out for a while. A race that was completely irrelevant to the city of Norman, but it technically said the Honorable Mayor of the city of Norman, Cindy Rosenthal, on the flyer. So we found it pretty difficult to come up with a way to create ethics that were governed by this body and have them be applied equally and fairly, I think. And for me, I don't think any of us should endorse city council candidates or mayor candidates, people that we work with. But if I wanted to endorse somebody for governor, I should be allowed to without 5 other people on council that don't like me deciding, well, we're going to kick Stephen off the council because he endorsed somebody for governor and we didn't like it, So I think we really struggle with trying to come up with, we all thought, well, there are definitely ethics violations, but how do we do that? It's really sort of the integrity of the person to a certain extent is what we found, but I would love to explore other options. We've got new faces on the council now with different ideas than we had back then. So, but that was one of the more difficult things that we wrestled with a couple of years ago was how to, and that's why there aren't any consequences because we couldn't even figure out.
I mean, I would argue that the consequence lies in the challenge or in the accusation. I can think of it in your situation, for example, where you've been accused of an ethics violation, which makes the headlines of the newspaper, but when the council decides it's not a violation, it's not even mentioned, So it's a double-edged sword there. I mean, I can see in your
That's right.
specific circumstance of having a contract, a legal written document, that connects, but I'd certainly hate to see where an employee of OU couldn't be on council and because they're going to vote on OU matters.
10,000 employees.
Whatever do you mean, Councilmember Carter?
Well, and I almost forgot about that. I had an ethics violation filed against me because I encouraged people to vote against the district attorney.
Not even vote against him, run against
Yeah,
him.
run against him. I didn't believe he's fit for office, and people should run against him. So because it appeared on a post on my council member Stephen Tyler Holman page, someone filed an ethics violation against me. Actually, a fellow council member did. So
I remember it really well.
I would just, and it was,
wondered
and I
who that
just
could
got
have
up on the podium and said, yeah, I don't think you should vote for District Attorney Greg Mashburn. So file your ethics violation against me for that. I'll take it. But,
Councilmember
that's.
Carter, do you have anything
No,
else?
I've said enough.
Why would you feel that way?
Yeah. So, anyway.
Any other questions or comments?
I'll just
Councilmember
comment
Scott?
really quick. I do think those are very different situations, though. Like, an endorsement of a political candidate isn't an ethics violation, in my opinion, unless you're directly benefiting from their election somehow, like, selected to be in their cabinet. But how do you prove that in advance? Like, and then, but if it comes to business and, it seems to me like a direct conflict of interest if something you're voting on directly benefits your pocketbook. Or promotes your business unfairly.
And the endorsement issue's been fixed in the ethics
Yeah, of
ordinance,
course.
so.
But that's what I'm considering.
Yeah.
So, but I understand where you're coming
Yeah.
from.
Same.
Councilmember Carter?
I have a different question about a different section. Moving on. I'm still a little vague on this language in the terms of office for the mayor and city council people. It just, down here where it's underlined, if a candidate's ward's designation is changed in the 6 months prior to the election due to reapportionment, then the requirement of 6 months durational residency shall be waived, although the candidate is still required to live in the newly established boundaries. That's almost like
at the time of filing. As it exists now, they would have to live within the boundaries at the time of filing, and essentially if a reapportionment action moves them out of a particular ward or into a particular ward, so that they haven't been there for 6 months prior to the election, they could then file in that ward even though they haven't lived there 6 months because they lived there at the
But then
time
they're
they
gonna have to
filed.
move into the new.
No, this is just if the districts or wards are reapportioned in the 6 months leading up to filing. So you can't achieve 6-month residency because of an action we've taken to reapportion the wards.
Oh, so you can't achieve it.
Right.
So what happens if reapportionment takes an existing council person out of their ward?
By charter, they serve the remainder of their term. They're not taken out of office. And it would
But
just
then if they
affect
wanna
the next
run for
term.
reelection, they have to move.
Be the battle of the incumbents.
Or run in
It's
the other
happened.
ward.
I mean, it's happened before.
Yeah.
I'd say that's
Happened?
Like,
But who are you
why
representing?
Ward
Sorry.
Four.
Yeah, I know, I said.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Scanlon, I'm coming for your seat.
No, that's why Ward 4 has that leg that goes down all the way down to
What does Jolly
Imhoff
Roger think?
along Pickard, because Carol Dillingham in 2011 lived on South Pickard, and so they didn't want to redraw her out of her own district. So Ward 4 goes all the way down to Imhoff.
So who
That's
does?
how gerrymandering starts.
Yep.
So, but my house is on the edge of Ward 7 and Ward 4. So an example, I guess, would be is in 2 years, if my house were to get redrawn into Ward 4, I would be eligible to run for the Ward 4 seat in 2022, even though my house would have only been in Ward.
Would you occupy both seats? Does he get two?
That would be
votes?
weird, I guess.
Is he sitting in
get
two
it.
seats or two people sitting in one seat?
Councilmember Patron?
So, I think I'm still a little bit unclear on the pay scale. It says the committee asked the language be drafted to recommend a stipend between $450 to $650 per month for council members and $675 to $975 per month for the mayor. Would we decide what that number is before it went to the ballot? Or are we,
I think that was what we were,
Yes.
okay,
that's what we were
so
hoping.
it's not the 5-member,
Right,
they would just decide the next adjustments from then on out?
right, right.
Okay.
All right, then we'll see you next quarter.
Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much for your service.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Does anybody need a break before we
I
dive?
need to go to the
Yes,
bathroom.
all right. We're gonna take a quick, I'm just gonna say, a bathroom break. Everyone come right back.
Literally all I'm doing. Like Game of Thrones had it right.
I read this article today in
Shame.
USA
All right.
Today about this thing called Hyperloop.
Parade them through the city.
We are back in the
down.
study
And
session.
they're building a
We're
prototype
live.
in Dubai.
And we are
Relentless.
going to our second topic, which is the update and discussion on the Norman Transit System. We've got Taylor and Sean, so please take it away.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We are your transit division. Two of us, Taylor and Sean. I think this was on your, you scheduled a mid-year update of our transit system. That's why we're here. We meet monthly with Council Planning and Transportation Committee, Councilmember Holman's group, to talk about stuff. We do need some direction from you tonight, if you will, as we get to those points. I'm going to kick us off, and then Taylor's going to drill down a little bit with you. I want to mention Michael Scroggins is in the back of the room here with Embark. Michael is the Marketing and IT Director. He's been kind enough to stay with us. Thank you for coming down, Michael, and staying with us late tonight. We'll be brief as much as we can, too, for you. We know it's getting late. Michael and Taylor spend a lot of time together, not as much as I do with them, but he's a major liaison to us on a daily basis. So we're going to cover, again, the milestones. We are a 6-month-old transit system. We have been operating bus transit for a whole 6 months. We need to talk about branding. We need to decide what we're going to be called. We're no longer CART. All of the CART stuff is off of the buses, and so the buses are looking kind of rough. We want to clean them up and get our name on there, but we don't know what you want our name to be, so we'll talk about branding. We have a master plan that some of you may not be aware of. We talked to the CP&T group about this, and we've had a master plan for the bus transit system for a number of years. We think we need to update that now that it's a different system or a different operator. We are, I think, the only transit system in Oklahoma that is operating with free fares, if that's true.
Edmund.
And Edmund, I beg your pardon, Edmund has free fares as well. And we've done that as sort of an interim thing, and we need to know if you want to move away from that. As I'm sitting in the budget session last week, I'm thinking giving things away free is probably not something we should be doing as a city. Revenue is important to us in our budget, and maybe you want to think about that differently. So we need a little direction on how you want to handle that, send that back to the CP&T and have further discussion. There's a lot of arguments on both sides of that equation of whether free fares are okay or whether not to have free fares. And then we'll finish with kind of the challenges. We've got one major challenge that's evolving in recent days or weeks, and then next steps in the process. So just quickly talk about where we've been. So as you know, July 1st, we met our goal established by the University of Oklahoma to take over the system, and that the most important part of that was to become a grant recipient of the Federal Transit Administration. We were successful in doing that. As you know, that took an actual act of the governor, as the mayor has said in a number of our presentations, and it really did. So lots of work went into that. We spent obviously lots of months, several months ahead of July 1st to get all the pieces in place. But officially, we became the transit operator and grant recipient on July 1st of 19. On August 5th, we began operating our fixed route system with our partner Embark, or Embark began running it for us with the administration by this team here. So about a month into that fiscal year, in that intervening month, the University of Oklahoma was doing it all. So they ran fixed routes, paratransit, and they were doing fleet maintenance for us. So we kind of, as you know, we kind of transitioned away from the university.
Sean, when I was reading this morning and I saw that, I thought to myself, I haven't received near as many complaints about paratransit since we made that transition. Has anyone else, has that been better?
Yeah.
So, okay.
It's getting a lot better. Lots, again, growing pains, and it was difficult, but not certainly anyone's fault. Then on October 1st, Embark made that big step into taking over the entire paratransit system, and again, you could see improvements immediately. And then November 7th, we did one of our first route alterations at the request of council. We added the central library to our routes. That the new library wasn't on the routes, and we thought that was really important, given that we had just opened our brand new beautiful library. So we made our first route change, and this is something that Taylor And Michael and other transit experts figured out how to do that without getting off the hour cycle and so on. Not something you just do. There's a process there. And then, as you all know, big day on November 12th, voters of Norman approved an 8-cent sales tax for public transit services. And by the way, if you haven't heard me say that, we think we are the only city in Oklahoma that has had that kind of support for transit only. There's been lots of mixed transit votes. Maps 4 had some transit element into it. Tulsa had some transit elements, but as a standalone election, we think we're the only ones that have done that successfully. And it's nothing to sneeze at, given that we had, 72% support for that. So really a big win there, and we're thrilled that next year, when the revenue starts coming in, that we'll be in a much better position than we are today.
Thank you, Norman.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, and thank you for all of your work. For everyone, we spent a lot of time together, Mayor and council members, but certainly with the mayor. She did a lot of hard work getting out there, talking to lots of groups. So, okay, I'm going to have
Councilmember Hall?
Sean, would you just remind me when we start? Is it April that we start collecting the?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we start collecting, and I think Anthony said recently we'll see the first number.
Tax is effective April 1st.
Okay.
But remember, that just means that it's being collected at the businesses.
Okay.
We will get our first remittance of that sales tax on or about June the 10th.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So Taylor's going to take into our, did I cover all the dates? Yep. Yeah, Taylor's going to take into this branding exercise. Oh, did I cover that?
I think you missed the fleet maintenance, I think.
Oh, beg your pardon. I want to mention, Taylor reminded me here, the other thing we did on October 1st was we, the city, took over the fleet maintenance operation. I can tell you our fleet staff is not real happy about that because they had plenty of work to do before, but we have been able to hire 3 mechanics. We're operating out of the OU garage operation. One of our biggest challenges, I've told you this story, was when the university was running it, their drivers would finish every route at 10 o'clock at night, and they would fuel up the vehicle, and they would check the vehicle, and they would clean. Every vehicle gets washed and mopped and cleaned, and windows cleaned. It's a very clean operation. Well, the union rules for the Embark drivers doesn't allow them to do that. So in our first week of operation, we had to figure out how to wash and clean and fuel 28 vehicles or 25, whatever, running that day between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. We were very lucky to find an OU student who was willing to come on board and do that, and that person is still doing that for us. But it's a race every night to get all of that done. They have to have a CDL because they have to drive the vehicle through the fueling station, through the wash, and so on and so forth, and they literally have to mop and clean our vehicle. So that's an example of one of the hires that we've had to make that we never saw coming.
Thank you.
We're fortunate to have that person, and we're going to need another one of them
Okay.
here in the next year to do that. So.
Councilmember Carter?
Can you jog my memory on, so we were waiting on a federal grant or federal money for the maintenance facility, and what is all that?
I will talk about that in a moment if you'll let me.
Okay, yeah.
That's
Okay.
one
Is it on the agenda?
It is,
Okay.
and it's not very good news. It's one of our biggest concerns, frankly. So Taylor will get into a little bit more of the branding with you for now.
So moving on to our first agenda item, the branding. Like Sean said, we really just want some clarification from council on what Norman Transit will be called and what it'll look and walk and talk like. So this is kind of what Michael and I and the rest of the team have looked into, honoring both the city of Norman and that regionalization that was key in our discussions that we've had. If you'll notice, it's the same decals as the Embark buses that are operating in Oklahoma City. However, the word Norman has been placed below Embark on all the faces, and we've also added the brought to you by the city of Norman and the flag on the back and on either side as well, just to give homage to the city more in a pronounced way.
Speaking of flag,
The soon-to-be seal.
yeah, we're in the
city of
process of perhaps possibly developing a flag in addition to what would become the logo. So if we move forward with branding and then decide we want to wrap some buses with this new flag, what'll that look like?
To completely wrap them, or just replace this logo and put something else on there?
Wrap.
Well, I think
Like, do we have to have the Embark logo on there, or can it just say Embark Norman, and then we do whatever we want with the colors?
that's kind of what we're looking for direction here tonight. I think the idea was with the idea of regionalization, the buses both in Oklahoma City and Norman would somewhat look like each other. However, we wanted to make sure that Norman was on these buses as well, and that's where we came to this middle ground right here.
So when the time comes that we get a new flag, how much will it cost to change it if that's what we decide to do?
To change that small decal that I have blown up there, I don't think would be very much. It's just the decal that's on the window.
Busting
and on the
her
back of the
bubble
bus.
there,
Yeah.
Taylor.
Think
She's
bigger, Taylor.
deflating by
Think
the
bigger.
second.
Okay, how much will it cost to change the
Oh,
bus?
Put a wrap on it.
Right.
It could be a paint job. Some of these are not
Yeah.
able to be wrapped, they're paints. And
Okay.
so that's why
That's my
That's why
question.
we've not made this decision. We're gonna spend lots and lots of money to repaint or re-decal these 28 buses based upon your decision here.
Right.
And do we have to do it now? Because I'd kind of like to wait to see the outcome.
Your call, Mayor. We just think they're looking pretty shabby, and we'd like to get some identity and get the buses cleaned up. But you tell us what you want to do. This was a collaboration between
And this is bad.
Embark and Norman.
Don't think
staff.
I hate it, because I
Sure.
don't. I'm just saying,
Understand.
there's things coming. Okay, like a bunch of hands went up. So Scanlon, Holman, Bierman, Patron, Scott.
I think that looks fine. However, one of the things that might provide income is wrapping the buses with ads. And this forgoes that option in a time where we're grubbing for money.
Right. That is something that we did at the university. Was had an advertising company that took care of all of that, and then came and wrapped the buses with the size that the person wanted or the business wanted. And we are in discussions with Embark on how we could be included in their partnership that they have with an advertising company, because they would just come in and over these decals and place an ad on a place on the bus. It wouldn't actually not allow us to do that.
Are we talking about a board inside the bus, or are we talking about?
On the outside.
A full bus wrap.
Somebody could pay to wrap the whole bus and cover all these decals, and they'd still be under there. And we.
The decals are usually still visible on the buses that are wrapped.
Well, if it's a full wrap, I don't think it would be. Is that right, Michael? Right. So, but some people can just pay for a panel on the side of a bus. It doesn't have to be the whole thing.
And doing this wouldn't preclude either one of those.
No,
But
not at
again, I'm anxious about money, and that seems like a way to get a few dollars.
Right. And that's something we're looking into.
It absolutely is. And we're still working on our advertising agreement with Tyler and another company that does the wraps.
But
Again, a typical wrap of a whole bus is a $5,000 or $10,000 endeavor. So most of the companies who do that are making a fairly
I
serious
thought
commitment.
Tyler was primarily focused on bus stops.
They are, and then there's another company that does the wraps for us, for Embark.
Okay, Holman?
Along those same lines, like Walden Cleaners is an example. They have a full bus wrap. They did. I don't know if they still do right now, but they did. A couple years ago, a former council member, Tom Kovach, he wrapped a bus for when he was running for re-election one year. So it was just running up and down. He wrapped the, I think the Lloyd Noble Center shuttle, the campus one. So his name, Tom Kovach, listen leads, was up and down the asphalt.
That's a great idea.
That's the best idea.
So, but very expensive.
Those were two guys
So,
shaking.
in my opinion, based on where we're at and the circumstances today, I would prefer that, that all the buses just as a basis look like that. That would be fine with me. And then having the option of businesses or the city, if we want to do a wrap of a bus of our own, being able to purchase that ability. But I think having just a basis that matches the buses in OKC but has our name on them, simple, and keeps them from looking, just blank rolling down the street like they are right now. So I think it's simple enough, it's easy enough, it matches, and still keeps the door open to whenever the flag issue is. I'm not sure what the timeline is for when any decisions might be made on a new flag or what. I know the discussions are going on, but is that, in the next 6 months or a year, are we gonna make that decision? So, but I would be okay with, going with this right now just for having something on them.
Thank you. Councilmember Bierman.
So kind of to the flag point, I know a little bit about vexillology. Who am I kidding? I've listened to 7 or 8 podcasts, so I'm an expert. That they tend to be, the best ones tend to be iconic because they have somewhat simplified, easily recognizable designs on them, like Chicago as an example. So I think even with this, there is room on there for what I hope is our beautiful and iconic and recognizable flag to kind of even go along with what is already there. I personally am less excited about advertisements. I come from the land of no billboards. So to my core, I am very anti-external screaming advertisements. Totally fine with the inside. Not super thrilled with the outside, but I'll get over that. But I wouldn't want to limit what we want to do with the buses based on a marginal, what I assume will not be a huge amount of advertising revenue. So I want our buses to look awesome, and I don't want to plan for advertisements. If it's a necessary eventuality, so be it.
Okay, Councilmember Patron.
Okay, so, not sure how to say this without it coming across as mean. I think your artwork is nice, but it kind of looks like updated Winnebago, like updated colors. If it was orange and brown on those stripes, we'd basically have the 70s style rather than blue and gray. You see what I'm saying? Like, I just think we can do a lot more exciting, better. And as far as the flag, whatever that ends up being, I would hope that would be like as big as the arrows, like exponentially larger. Like, let's tag it up, let's update the idea of what a bus, make it, our public transit. If we're branding it, let's really brand it.
Yeah.
Would be my initial thoughts. Next, I would say, do we have to even, I can understand putting like Embark Norman up there on that banner, but do we have to even be Embark? Can we have our own?
You signed a contract with them, Councilmember.
I understand it would still say Embark up there, but like our own public transit that's not just the bus. Like, we're looking forward to the RTA, and this is just a major element of that, but it's not the only element. There's going to be other kinds of public transit as well. That's the whole, the 3-part system.
Yeah, I love it.
If that has a name to it as well, that is part of, on the first part of the bus. So the bus portion of the RTA.
Can I tell them?
Okay.
So the Regional Transit Authority of Central Oklahoma. What are the initials of that?
RTA, okay?
ACO.
Our taco is the initials.
There we go. Our taco.
That's why I didn't try and restrain him. There was no way to hold that back.
Bus
We can
could look
put
like
a
a taco.
taco. It's our taco.
Oh my god. It's
Anyway,
better than Bart and Dart. Come
so-
on. All sorts
But
of
yeah,
marketing.
there's fun stuff that can be done with
That's
the
not
RTA
the actual name, that's
as
just
far
been
as
thrown out.
It's just a
branding
joke.
for the
Hopefully.
Norman side of it. I don't know, but I understand that Embark would still be up there. It would still say Embark on it, but it can have another
Or just
name too.
taco.
And then not big on the ads either. Again, just because I think that art is kind of a better way to go, maybe. But the public can probably really weigh in on this and make it a fun thing to do and come up with some really cool ideas for what our bus looks like. If you're talking about a really expensive paint job for a couple of arrows, I say wait. Wouldn't want to dump a bunch of money into just some arrow paint, and when I think this is something that we can bring folks to the table and help us come up with some cool way to tag up the bus.
Okay. Councilman Scott.
I'm in agreement with Councilmember Patron. Not that I think this is sleek, but I also think that it would be pretty rad if we commissioned local artists to literally tag up, graffiti the buses and, some sort of Norman fashion. We are, the city of festivals, an artistic town. We have a Norman Arts Commission, and I think that they might have some value to offer if we were, looking at something so permanent. We could still have, I mean, Embark will be on there ultimately, right? But it's, Norman is very unique, and we have, you know, a lot of artists, and I think that I really like the idea of actually tagging up the bus, you know, like you see those train cars go by that have graffiti all over them, and graffiti is a form of expression, and I think that since Norman is so expressive and unique, that would be appropriate for these large buses that drive around our town and serve our citizens. So maybe consulting the Norman Arts Council about that and looking at local artists.
Councilor Hall and then Scanlon.
I'm just curious about, is this new artwork?
This is the brand that Embark has
Okay,
adopted.
that's
and this
my
is-
question.
Yeah,
So
so we were trying to be mindful of their,
this is the
contract.
same
As a-
branding as in Oklahoma City?
that's exactly right.
Okay, so, because I do like all these ideas, I do like having some kind of naming, you know, that the public participates in, and maybe some, I mean, I definitely want to incorporate either our current flag or, you know, what's coming soon, and make sure that we're considering that that's coming down the road. But I'm also, well, I guess the first question is, so what contractual obligations do we have to have this on the bus? I mean, does it have to be this big? What are we required to have on our Embark buses?
I don't want to put Michael on the spot, but again, we've tried to strike that balance between our agreement with Embark and regional
Okay.
bus transit, what their branding is, and then what we might do to make it our own. Michael, thoughts on the legal implications here, I guess?
Excuse me, I think the agreement is that for the first year, it's just in line with the existing Embark brand.
Which is what this is?
Correct.
Okay, okay.
So if you want us to renegotiate that contract next year, it'll be up in probably June, and go through some kind of a rebranding process, we're happy to do that. Just tell us. But for now, we're pretty obligated to be
So I
Embark.
guess my follow-up question, maybe with you, is if this is an obligation for the rest of this year, then how much negotiating room is there for changing this as we go into a new contract year?
That's a great question. We'd have to engage our director and probably the COPPA board as well as to
Okay.
how far they want to deviate from that.
Uh-huh.
A significant investment, as you are exploring here in your system, is something that we've already undergone, and there's a lot of equity already built. So it'd just be something that they'd have to answer.
Okay, thank you. Because I guess my thought is, I for sure want to make sure that we have a way to express ourselves as Norman, but I'm also in agreement with Councilmember Holman that I think we should be really proud of the fact that we're, one of the first to jump on to build that foundation piece, if I understand it, for participating in the Regional Transit Authority, and that, there should be some claim to the regional aspect of this also, of yes, we are a part of this, we are on this team, we are moving forward with that. So, not sure how to strike that balance, but those are just my thoughts.
Well, and to speak to that, Councilmember Hall, the RTACO, if you will, or RTA of Central Oklahoma, we all know is they're looking at a funding mechanism, what that actually looks like, and I think eventually there probably will be that discussion of what is the regional brand, what does that look like. I think right now, if we're talking about striking a balance for the regional branding, I think something like this kind of fits that for now until the RTA really gets on its feet and starts building infrastructure and getting things underway. The alternative, I guess we could throw the RTA logo on there, but again, that doesn't may not mean a lot to a lot of people because they're not aware of what the RTA logo would mean. So I was just speaking to, I think the Embark brand in the region is kind of that regional brand as of right now, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Councilmember Scanlon, then Scott, and then Holman.
My question was essentially, what are the contractual restrictions for doing what, and Leanne asked that question. Essentially what I heard is, after a year, all bets are off, we can negotiate whatever we can negotiate.
But we would be making if we went with a brand like this and painted the buses and threw these decals on there, we would be making, like Michael said, a big investment for about 5 or so months left in this remaining fiscal year, just to keep that in mind.
How big are we talking?
How big is this bus?
No, how big is the investment in painting them?
We don't actually have a quote for painting them white and then putting the decals on, or for the paint, but Michael may be able to speak to the decals.
We looked at it initially, we're around the 3,000 mark.
Yeah.
If it's a solid white bus, and some of these buses you probably need to repaint white just because they've had several years of use. Also keep in mind you have bus stop signage, and you also have the paratransit fleet, which also has a modified version of the brand as well. So there's several pieces that we'd be looking at impacting as well as the buses themselves.
So if we have 20 buses and then the paratransit, we could easily be talking $75,000.
Wow. It took Embark several years to get all the buses converted to the new fleet, just because of the capital outlay in that.
So I'm assuming there might be some interest in waiting to see if we can renegotiate some creative license. Shoot me straight. What are the shots on that?
I mean, again, it's going to be something our director and the board would look at. I think we'd definitely include Sean and Taylor, that the city manager, in that discussion as, you know, how close are we to an RTA, and having some of those real conversations there will help, I think, give you better information to make a decision from.
Thank you. Councilor Scott?
So assuming all that goes well and we have some creative authority, we could mesh Councilmember Scanlon's idea with Patron's idea of the ads. We could go, and I'm thinking about tacos now, to businesses and ask them if they would like to sponsor some art on the bus, like Torchy's Tacos, for example. We could draw the little devil on it and it's driving around town. You see what I'm saying? We have creative authority, it'd be great. Or Winston's, if they wanted to, you know, sponsor a bus, and we can put their $2 Tuesday tacos near.
It's Donuts Bus.
Okay.
This is where my head and stomach are at now.
Councilmember Holman?
I was just going to say that I like those ideas too. I do, but I do think that we are, if everything goes according to plan, which it probably won't, but in best case scenario, you know, the city of Norman, we're only operating this system for a few years, less than 5 potentially. And this will become, our bus system will become part of the Metropolitan OKC system, and the bus in Edmond will look like the bus in Norman, just as the DART buses in Dallas that serve Garland and Carrollton and Plano, they all have the DART logos and emblems on them. I would assume that would still allow us, just like any business can, the city of Norman could purchase the rights to a bus or the advertising rights to a bus, and we could wrap it anyway or do, I guess, to a certain extent what we want to do with it. I don't know if they would let us spray paint it or not, but that's kind of why I'm thinking some of the buses. I just rode the Main Street bus today all the way around for an hour with my girlfriend, and some of them, you know, without anything on them, they do look a little rough. And a lot of the stops still say cart, and it's all faded, and you know, you can still see like the stickers on them. And I would hate for all that to just sit like that for another 6 months while we figure out what we want to do in a long term that won't even really be a long term. So, I mean, that's kind of why I felt like simple matches the buses that exist already. And if we want to, we could, I don't know, pay for advertising since we're already paying for the system. Not sure how that works. Can we grant ourselves, say, advertising on a bus or two? But that's kind of where I kind of arrived where I did on that.
Fair point. Thank you. Councilor Patron?
Rather than paint the whole thing, what, for the, just doing the decals, could we just do stickers?
Well, that's what these. You mean cover up the bad spots on the buses instead of painting them entirely white?
Okay, I guess Are the arrows, the big blue and gray, is that paint or is that sticker?
Those are decals if the bus was entirely white.
So that's a sticker.
Right.
Okay, and same with the Embark Norman, that's a sticker.
Right.
And what you're saying is that you feel like it needs to be painted, the major expense here is painting them white.
Right, but as Michael mentioned, it still is about $3,000 for those decals to be produced and put on the buses as well.
Per bus.
Right.
Okay, and then, sorry, he mentioned that it took Oklahoma City several years to get theirs all branded. Why do we only have until June?
We, our council budgeted in our one-time startup costs with for this system this year money to be able to do this.
We'll stretch out as long as you'd like. We just thought we'd like to get the fleet cleaned up and in service like you intended it to when you adopted that budget. But part of the challenge is it's really difficult to take the buses out of service. I mean, they're running from 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. So it's a careful dance to take a bus out of service long enough just to get these decals on, let alone paint jobs and all that. So we just need to figure out what you want and then start scheduling that in to our abilities to do it over the next 6 months. We may not get all 28 done, but sure.
Okay, I mean, if I had my druthers, I would be, I'm interested in putting the Embark, you know, I understand that they want their name on the bus. I get that part of it. I am not as interested in, you know, until we know what kind of, self-expression we can do with our bus to, you know, better communicate our city and hopefully increase ridership, make it something that's exciting to be a part of, and get the community to the table to help us really get that unique quality to it. I would prefer that we don't just jump right in and you know, sink a ton of money into them when we could have done something really cool. That's my personal opinion.
Councilmember Carter and then Councilmember Hall.
So you've said you've got them stripped down now, all the old cart decals off, or no? Or
Right, they're all in a different state of
Yeah.
condition, Councilmembers.
Yeah,
2 of them are
yeah.
new, they're white.
Yeah. I personally don't like the idea of leaving them looking janky. I think there's a lot of value in making it look professional, you know? And so I don't believe we should wait. That'd be my opinion. And then I'm comfortable with, you know, I think we have an obligation with and obviously have a legal obligation with Embark to make these buses appear similar. I really like the idea of the creativity that I'm hearing from that end of the table. And that's something for us to look into, and doesn't sound like wildly, in a $5 million a year budget, a wildly crazy idea that we might spend 30 or 40, you know, or 20 and use a business sponsorship. I think that sounds like a great idea. For $3,000, we might do that. You know, I mean,
Sure.
That doesn't sound like, that's not an obstacle too far. And I think in terms of, you know, if you're looking at, you know, budgeting to me is about priorities and choices. If you gave me the choice of free bus fare, I could have free bus fare if we had advertising. I would choose advertising. You know, I mean, like you said, you know, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need advertising, but we don't live in a perfect world. And so, you know, I was always really in favor of the free fare thing, you know, but realize we're getting some really stiff budgeting challenges. So, but given the choice between the two, I would have free fares over and then choose advertising. That helps.
So I want to make sure I'm not confused about the $3,000. Is that for the decals or is that for painting the bus plus the decals?
That is just for the decals.
Okay, so what does it cost to paint the bus?
That's what we haven't got into the cost estimate
Okay.
for that right now,
Okay.
but we would, with council's blessing, look into that, and that'd be part of the cost to retrofit all the buses.
Okay.
What was our total
Do you-
budget to do
Do you have
this?
any idea approximately? Okay, that's okay.
Council budgeted about $1 million in startup costs for everything from branding, decals, painting, fare boxes, there's a
Yeah,
long list.
fare
of
boxes were like
technology.
300,000 if I remember.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
coming up next on your agenda,
Yeah,
but
okay.
again, lots of things were built into
Okay,
that.
it's part of that giant, it
Mhm.
wasn't a line item per se,
Mhm.
it was just part of that amalgam of.
They really
startup
tried
costs.
to help us with the cost projections, but I wouldn't I wouldn't hesitate to think you'd spend 10 or 20,000 on a paint job if you had to paint the entire the entire bus. We'd have to contract that out. That's not
Yeah.
a service that we have. So, yeah, the 3,000 could become 10 or 15 pretty quickly.
Okay, so it seems like it would be important to get the buses painted first. And then figure out, I mean, I think what you're saying is we have an appropriated amount of money that you can use that you have access to this year. So you want to make the best use of that in the rest of the time we have, right?
That and get an identity, get
Yeah.
a brand.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly Embark wants that as well, so.
Well, I'm just thinking, it seems like it's really important to get the buses painted to get that fresh look. But if we're talking $3,000 a bus for how extensive this kind of decal would be, I'm just wondering, you know, what if we thought about getting that Embark piece that's at the top, you know, and maybe just having freshly painted buses while we're thinking about the community involvement and what we're going to name it and what kind of branding opportunities, if we're only talking about an obligation that goes through June, but we want to refresh all these buses, which seems really important, but then maybe have that part of building the interest in the branding that we're going to get with the community and community engagement.
Councilmember Holman?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say just in light of that, maybe paint the buses white, put Embark naming on them, and
At
then
that
don't worry
top.
about the arrows and stuff since those are kind of bigger. I don't know if there's really that much of a cost difference, but be simple, still says what it is, and looks clean enough and professional. So I'd be okay with that. That's cheaper and faster, especially when you mentioned that, you know, taking them out of service is an issue. So maybe painting them and throwing on the Embark Norman emblems.
Be happy to take that back to Embark. This is their brand. The stripes and all that it's a whole deal. So I'm happy to take your direction back to them and try to negotiate that into the current contract. But they may, I don't know, they may insist on the whole,
Right.
this is what we are.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's gotta be blue and gray and so on. So, yeah.
Well, that'd be good to find out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Let's move on. We'll negotiate that out.
Moving on to the Transit Master Plan, which is a part of the current Norman Comprehensive Transportation Plan. A little bit of background on this item. In 2008, and the CP&T committee may have heard a little bit of this at the last meeting, but in 2008, CART developed a long-range public transit plan. It was based on a needs assessment in 2003. It did produce some recommendations that involved phases of service, and at the end of the day, most of the implementation was not realized due to the lack of the funding. In 2014, the city adopted a comprehensive transportation plan. In that plan, a transit subcommittee recommended enhancements to that CART plan. They took that as a base and kind of enhanced it. They discussed both the local and regional needs, where the CART original plan just kind of focused on the local needs. They developed, instead of 3 phases, they developed more in-depth, immediate, ongoing, short-range, medium-range, and long-range action items to be consistent with the rest of the comprehensive transportation plan. And again, like I said, it was incorporated in the adopted plan of May 2014. And just a quick look, I know these are a lot of words, but I just wanted to make the point that there's quite a few action items in that comprehensive transportation plan related to transit. And some of them were completed or were kind of ongoing and looking into. For example, under short range there on the right side, there used to be the Lindsay East and Lindsay West routes used to operate on kind of a figure 8, where one would operate 30 minutes and then the other 30 minutes on the hour the other side would operate.
One bus.
Right, one bus.
Yeah,
so one of the action items in this plan was to look into maintaining CART service frequency on Lindsay East and West routes year-round, So splitting those and maintaining that on a 30-minute schedule on each segment for the full year. And that was completed by CART. I'll say that the last action item on the short range side, study the needs, methods, and implications of establishing a dedicated source of funding for CART or transit. I think we kind of did that this past fall, so that's been completed recently. But just the point that there's quite a few action items in that plan related to transit, and the subcommittee as well as staff and council did their homework on this back there.
Councilmember Bierman? I feel a little bit like I'm peeking under Pandora's box right now, but can you tell me what the Norman Thoroughfare plan is?
In reference to that first action
Yeah.
item on.
I think, Councilmember, I think that is also part of the comprehensive transportation plan, and it was the identification or the update of classified roads, arterials, collectors, and local.
Okay.
We had never mapped or identified collector streets in Norman. We use that term, but we've never mapped it. And so that thoroughfare plan addresses those classifications, local, collector, and arterial. And with that classification came design standards. So an arterial has to be so wide, so many lanes, so on and so forth, that kind of thing.
I'm really glad that this is not referring to any kind of acquisition of property for highway expansion or anything like that, because I've been through that twice in 2 different communities, and I hope I never go through that again.
This was just the classification plan, I think. I think that's what that's.
And there was language under each of these action items that went into more depth, and I think this one mentioned transit because, like Sean said, the design standards for different types of streets, and transit tries to be less on residential streets and more on arterials and different types. So.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next page, it's just a quick look at the final, what the idea was for the final system if all of the implementation was realized. You can see there we have routes going up to the, all the way north to the county jail, as well as going southeast to Cedar Lane. So quite extensive. Of course, this is if money is no object, but I just wanted to give you a quick look at what that map looks like with all those action items realized.
My, how ambitious.
Right. But this is what we're asked to do in long-range planning in general is, what do we look like in 20, 30 years? And I think the subcommittee did a good job, as well as staff and the consultant. And all this to say, when we go into our next steps here in a few slides, Sean and I will be looking at what updating this long-range plan looks like in the next year and a half. So what does that process look like? Now that the city is operating most of the routes, but not all of them, some of these assumptions change. Now that the transfer station is on campus, and is that going to be the long-term solution, or does it need to be looked at another site? How does that adjust the routes? And so these are things that we're going to be looking at. Maybe we scope out an updated long-range plan for a consultant to look at, and maybe do an RFP for the next year. So that'll come in the next steps, but just wanted to give some background for the current long-range plan that's on the books in our comprehensive transportation plan. Moving on to fare structure. A little bit of background. The most recent transit fare increase was in 2014, where the university did public meetings, consulted with council, and they, for sake of time, they increased the fixed route single trip from 50 cents to 75 cents, and then the paratransit zone 1 went from $1 to $1.50. So not a huge increase, but that was the last increase that we have seen in Norman. In our most recent history, our council approved free fare until October 31st, with the approval of the Embark contract on June 25th. We discussed fare in the September CP&T meeting, and were directed to extending the free fare period and amending the Embark and the City of Norman contract to extend the free fare period to December 31st, which we accomplished in October before the current free fare period ended. And then in December, we ultimately extended the free fare period, council and the Embark board, till June 30th of this year, just to give us some more time to think about what that fare structure will be, get council involved in the discussion more, and give us some time to really implement whatever council directed us to, instead of piecemealing it every 3 months like we kind of were at the beginning there. Just comparing the OU and Embark fare structure. If you look there on the left, you'll see the fixed route. Whenever the city of Norman took over the service, it was 75 cents for a fixed route single trip, and for Embark, currently it's $1.75. For paratransit, for Zone 1, we were at $1.50 under OU, and under Embark right now they're under $3.50 for a trip. Quick estimate of the fare revenue for fiscal year 19. Last fiscal year, OU collected about $79,000 in cash and pass fares, and then the city of Norman was allocating $35,000 for CDBG low-income bus passes, which brings our total to about $114,000 that the city of Norman saw in fiscal year 19. We, and this is a heavy dose of an estimate, because we didn't do a thorough fare structure, and some of these analyses are pretty in-depth, looking at other markets and the effects on the passengers and different things. But looking at the Embark fare structure, which is a 133% increase over the OU Cart one, if you look at the fixed route single trip, if you just looked at a simple 50% increase on the cash pass fare, you would see about $153,000 in fare revenue, or a quick estimate of 75% increase, you would see $173,000. Like I said, there is a much more thorough analysis that can and should be done with this type of estimating. For instance, when you see a fare increase, you always see a ridership decrease, and how does that affect the fare collection? You can't just assume the same people will take the same amount of trips. And so there's all these elasticities that you have to consider in these studies. But we wanted to provide at least a quick fare revenue for your consideration on this item.
City manager?
Taylor, quick question. One of the values of Farebox is data on ridership. How do we tell what our ridership's doing without the Farebox? What's the other mechanism?
Sure. So we have a vendor called Synchromatics that provides automatic passenger counters, or APCs, that have lasers above the doors that kind of count in and outflow. With the more modern fare boxes, though, they can tell you an estimate as well on how many people boarded, and get pretty accurate too. And it's kind of a checks and balances. If they need to be able to provide you a estimate on the ridership, so that way the cash that came in is close to that estimate that the cash should came in. So the driver's not taking money, or the driver's not just letting people on board that didn't pay, things like that. But we are getting estimates right now from our APCs, as well as if those aren't working, we get manual counts.
So I've got a quick question about the fare revenue. I read an article, Kansas City was the biggest metropolitan to get rid of their fares, and it's a give and take. You know, you reduce the fares, but then you miss out on the revenue that can help you increase routes and speed up routes. So that's something we all need to consider. Right now, we're already hearing it takes forever to get anywhere. What's the point? And so I get that we want it to be affordable, but if the routes aren't effective, it won't matter if it's free. So that article was really eye-opening to me, and I'm very curious to see how that plays out. Mm-hmm. Councilmember Bierman.
So I'm just concerned with how long it's going to take us to actually make money, even with putting in fare boxes, because I did a little 5-year math. I took the numbers that are on the next slide about the one-time cost, plus then I did 4 years of the ongoing annual cost, and it's going to cost us $608,000 over 5 years simply to collect money from people. And if we go just off of CART's current fares, so if we just re-implemented fares and didn't increase them, we would lose $38,000 in 5 years. So we would be spending $608,000 to lose $7.6 a year. And if we went to 75% of what Embark charged, which is still a pretty drastic increase, because now we have to think of it as going from 0 to whatever it is. The increase isn't from 75 cents to whatever, it's from 0, because they will have had it for free for a year. That only nets $257,000 in revenue in 5 years. It only nets us $51,000 a year. I don't think that there's all that much growth that we can count for with that. I mean, especially because that's just really optimistic numbers that don't take into account the decrease in ridership that'll happen when you go from 0 to whatever it is. So I did 5 years because I'm hoping that that's going to be right around the time of the RTA, and then the decision is in their hands. And so I'm not really liking what these numbers are telling me. So I'm not super thrilled with the idea of collecting fares and spending $608,000 to get in 5 years $865. And that's if all the numbers pan out with your kind of back of the envelope math to go along with mine. So,
Well, and Councilmember Berman, that completely explains why I keep going back and forth, because I don't know if it makes financial sense. But then if we're, again, focusing on regional transit, my fear is that we have someone who, let's say, gets off the Greyhound in Oklahoma City to get the Norman bus, but they're in Oklahoma City and they have no money, and they go to ride a bus because it's Embark. It looks just like their bus, and it has feet. The point of regional transit is it's the same wherever you go, and that's what flips me back to the other side. So I don't have an answer right now, and I appreciate the discussion that we're having, but I think those are both sides of the argument. Does it make financial sense, but then what's the point of regional transit? Councilmember Holman.
So I would say that in our position, we can't afford to upgrade these and lose money on them, but maybe in a few years the RTA may be in a position that they're willing to upgrade these and lose money on them. I think our argument to be we can't afford. It costs more money to collect money, and we don't have a lot of funds, and we've got bus replacement, we've got to build a new maintenance facility, we've got to build a new bus hub somewhere in downtown Norman that we don't even know where. So, I mean, I would say when the RTA is running and it's a completely different system that's run by a different governing body than us, then if they want to invest in that, then I would say they should. But for us, I think we've got a penny pinch, and it's kind of weird to say it'll cost us more money to collect a fare. It's cheaper to make it free, it seems. But
I think it would be helpful to see some hard numbers on that.
yeah.
I mean, Councilmember Bierman's pretty good at that, but I think it'd be good to see it. This is what it'll cost for 5 years, and not the 75% if we went the full thing. Because if we're gonna increase the rate, I feel like we might as well just go to the Embark one for the sake of consistency. I think it's one or the other at this point. So I'd like to see hard numbers on that, and I think that would help me visualize it a little better.
And just to clarify on the revenue, the 50% versus the 75% increase, that was just, we went to the Embark full fare, and I'm thinking we only saw a 50% increase in the revenue. We didn't increase the fare by 50%. Does that make sense?
Yes, okay. I see.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was
I didn't get that when Councilman Bruno was talking, but when you said that, I realized there was a little miscommunication. So
Now
this
I
was
really
just,
need to see the numbers, because I am kind of confused.
yeah.
right. So this was just my quick estimate of we went full Embark fare structure, and we saw a 50% increase in the cash and the passes that OU was selling.
See, I don't see that actually panning out at all, but I'm not an economist, so.
It would be helpful if we transfer this back to CP&T for future discussion when
Yeah.
we're meeting Thursday this week to
Yep.
keep drilling down. Be happy to do that.
Okay.
Okay,
I think that would, thank you.
move on.
Yeah.
Councilmember Holman?
On the same lines as the free ridership, I know one of the criticisms I've heard about it is the non-transportation related rides, camping out on the bus and just riding it all day. You know, it's really
Yeah,
hot
that's a good
outside or
point.
it's really cold. You know, one potential solution to that would be, you know, implementing like you can ride it a full route once or maybe twice, but then you have to get off. And then it goes back around and comes back around, you can get back on it, I guess. Something like that to govern it, or at least give the drivers an ability to say, okay, you've ridden the full route all the way around and you didn't get off. I mean,
Right.
It's a good point. I have
Something
heard
like
that
that,
concern.
yeah.
Thank you. Councilmember Bierman?
Yeah, I don't I don't see the chief here, 'cause I'm sure he wasn't expecting to get a question like this, but what authority, I don't know, what authority does Embark provide its drivers, or what kind of partnership do they have with the police department, or how do we give the drivers the tools or get NPD looped in? I don't know how that works, but I have heard that as well, and so
It really is a rider conduct policy. So what are we saying are the rules? I think at Embark, Michael, you guys have a 1-round trip policy. You pay your trip, you get on, you ride it for that trip, and then you have to get off the bus. And you can pay another one and ride it again, but it's just. But we could do that with free fare as well. You know, you got on the bus once, you need to get back off it at the transfer
wait
station.
for the next one.
Now the other flip side of that is they could catch the other bus at the transfer station and ride a different bus for the next hour or 30 minutes. But
Follow up.
there's all these.
I think that would be better, just because one of the complaints that I'm hearing is that it is clear that they've been there on that bus for a long time. You know, they start taking up multiple seats, and the drink goes over here, and the bag of food goes over here, and so, you know, if they're not given an opportunity, I don't begrudge someone wanting to get warm or feel like they have somewhere that's a little more secure than where they had it. But I think that going from, at least my opinion, is going from bus to bus is at least a marginal compromise from what we have, which is someone just camps out all day.
They can't camp quite as much if they have to at least move around.
Right.
Yeah, to answer your question, there are mechanisms we could put in place.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so current challenges, trying to wrap up here pretty quickly. The best term we could use was that we are still stabilizing. We're still trying to figure this out. I think I used the term with Daryl last week. We're still flying by the seat of our pants. We really are. It's the two of us. You don't have much of an operation yet. Embark's doing a great job for us, but we got a lot to do. And so just trying to figure out our budgets as we went in, and now we've got budget deadlines of Friday this week to submit our 21 budget. So we're still doing a lot of work trying to figure out what this is costing, how much revenue is coming in, still working on a lot of contracts, updating the advertising and so on and so forth. So I would call it, we just need another several months, 6 months, just to stabilize and keep this thing running, particularly as it relates to budgets, and council will be dealing with that very soon on the 2021 discussion. The FTA grant administration, you know, we built this on the notion of a $2 million annual grant. We've gotten this much, that much, zero. And the reason for that is that the FTA requires a great deal of administrative work. Some might call it bureaucracy, but we had to submit all kinds of policies and practices and commitments to them before they would release any of the funds. You'll have one of those on your agenda next Tuesday.
Yes.
So next Tuesday, Title VI program, working on the DBE program. Taylor is spending his time working on these programs, developing these policies, submitting them to FTA, and checking all the boxes. And we are hoping, Anthony keeps calling me to say, when are we going to see some money, O'Leary? And we are hoping that we can get all of this done, and then they will retroactively pay us our $2 million before June 30th. But no guarantees. We're doing the best we can. And that's really important in your current budget discussions on the general fund, because if that $2 million doesn't come in, you're $2 million more short than what Anthony said you were short on Thursday. So really important that we get that done, and our legal team is doing a great job helping us, but a lot to do. And that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of policies. We don't have a rider conduct policy. We don't have, you know, many of the policies. So we're kind of operating on Embark's policies for now.
Quick question.
Yes,
so
sir.
that $2 million, is that for the paratransit money?
Is for the operation of the entire system. By providing public transportation in a small urban system, we are eligible for up to $2 million.
And that's what OU was getting.
Yes.
Facility.
Yes, exactly.
And the transfer
Exactly.
station.
That was that whole grant recipient process it went through. So if we do everything right and according to the federal guidelines, we will get, at this point, $2 million a year in federal support. So that's the focus of a lot of our work and a lot of Taylor's work on a daily basis. Councilor Carter, you mentioned the bus maintenance facilities. You know, I might flip to that next slide for a moment. You know, we knew that when we took over the maintenance operation and the whole operation that we were obligated to provide a facility to manage about 35 drivers every shift, dispatchers, supervisors, you name it, and the maintenance of these buses. We signed a contract with the University of Oklahoma to lease their, or part of their Transportation Operations Center. We've extended that now until the latest June 30th of this year. On that basis, the city manager's office allowed us to proceed with the design of a new facility at North Base. We partnered with our EVT group. We're also been working for several years on an emergency vehicle transportation maintenance facility for fire trucks and police cars, which is in your PSST program. We're also obligated a bit to move the parks maintenance facility as part of your Norman Forward program. So on the screen you can see the final concept plan. This will also be on your agenda next Tuesday for approval of the land use changes, zoning, and plating that we've been going through the development process with. But you can see the combination of transit maintenance, parks maintenance, and fire storage of facilities, as well as the wash facility and parking and CNG and detention basins and so on and so forth.
But none of that is current buildings. This is what you're gonna build.
This is our dream. Our current facility where most of our public works operations are here. This is our current fleet operations.
Oh, I see.
These are our 1950s Navy buildings that we have. Just south of there would be this new facility. This is a greenfield today, basically. But the city does own the real estate.
Councilmember Scanlon.
I thought at one time we were talking about a large facility that would accommodate both buses and fire trucks.
Yes.
Is that, when
It
it
is,
says
and-
transit,
Yes,
what's
sir.
the difference between fire and transit, I guess is what
Yeah, so we got details. You'll see details on Tuesday with your agenda, but what's labeled transit is really transit / emergency vehicle maintenance. And so because buses and fire trucks are about the same size, chassis, and so on, we figured out early on here that we could combine some of those resources and build one facility. So I think this current proposal has 5 or 6 full depth stalls that would accommodate all the needs of fire and police, as well as the transit, if we can get it built and in operation. So that's how the architects have operated.
And so what's,
That is I would call that a little bit of an extra that the fire chief has requested, and that is cold storage. He feels like he needs another 2 stalls for storage of other equipment.
and I understand
Right.
that, I just didn't realize that that's what it was.
We see that as kind of a secondary priority, but certainly it's something that he thinks
Have
they...
storing stuff under an awning next to the tower of.
Exactly, exactly. So all that said, Councilmember Carter, you mentioned, the premise here was that certainly it wasn't that money was going to fall out of the sky, but you know, when OU gave up this program, they had taken a grant about 10 years ago to build that TOC on the campus. And when they transferred the system back to the city, they had to repay that grant to the federal government, about $3.2 million. And so we have been, Manager Pyle can speak to his discussions with our legislative group, but we've been sort of lobbying our legislators to get that $3.2 million back in Norman to use for this facility. It's not gone very well. Darryl, I don't know if you have any updates.
It's such an unprecedented set of circumstances. They don't have record of this scenario, so they are kind of charting a new course. But Representative Cole's staffers and Representative Cole himself, very well versed, pushing the issue on our behalf. They understand that it's really not a budget issue from the federal government's perspective. It's revenue coming into the treasury that was unanticipated, so to be able to put that back out, although it does have to go back through appropriations, doesn't mean they have to take $3 million away from anybody else. It's just a very slow-moving process. So
What can we do to help?
I was gonna say, is that gonna be something on our DC trip agenda?
that's an excellent opportunity. One of the
April.
things
I
that,
know,
yeah,
but
we
it
had
might not be-
on the list to be pushed up close and personal, not just with our representatives who know the story, but representatives they can direct us to push that same story.
I don't know, they don't like it if you bring up a topic that's not on the pre-approved agenda. I did that last year.
Councilmember Carter.
So when you say it's part of the appropriation process, does that mean it has to be assigned to an appropriations bill, passed through Congress, signed by the president, and then the money?
Yeah, because
It's not gonna
they
happen
can't spend
fast.
it back out of the treasury. It's, so it disappeared once, OU wrote the check. It went into a,
Right.
a multi-billion-dollar revenue pipeline. So we kinda have to start all over again.
Did our congressman have a feel for, or know when the next appropriation bill's due to be?
I didn't get a timetable from him, but I'll absolutely have that conversation with him.
I think that'd be a
tomorrow.
appropriate thing.
Yep. If they can kind of timeline that out for us and let us figure out how we can follow that through the pipeline and then, start making phone calls and writing letters when the time comes, that would help us out dramatically.
So that said, we don't feel really encouraged about that, and we need a place to maintain these vehicles. So, options available to us, we can go begging OU for an extended lease beyond June. That's probably the most logical first thing to do. They've been really clear with us that they have other plans for that building. So I don't know if we can buy a few months or so, but we're pretty concerned about this one. This is our biggest concern today. If we can't maintain the vehicles, we're in deep trouble on this program. And we need a big facility and a place to fuel and wash and do all that. So we're preparing to submit our budget on Friday. We're kind of working on this today. I'm not sure what to submit because we don't know where we're going to be in 6 months. But this is something that we'll add this to your budget challenges, Council. This is another major budget challenge, and this is pretty urgent. This one has got to be addressed either in a facility like this or find us a place to lease or something. I've even got the guys working on if we can spread a bunch of gravel and put up a couple mobile homes out here. We might be operating a very temporary transit operation here. At least we can get access to our CNG system, which is coming down here, and we'll be here in the bus parking area. At least we could park the buses here. If we had a wash facility, we could wash them. So we're going to look at every option we can come up with, but we really need this in a
Question?
short fashion.
It's not a fueling and washing solution, but if OU goes away, is there anything with Embark resources in the city that we could do heavy mechanical stuff with?
You mean Embark doing the...
I'm just wondering out loud in
Sure.
terms of where we can go if OU
Sure.
shuts the door.
That's a great question, and that's where we started. When we went to Embark last spring, we asked them to do all 3 phases of this program, and they respectfully declined doing the maintenance. They operate out of Oklahoma City. That's not practical. They don't own any facilities here. They didn't want to hire additional mechanics. They didn't want to take on the burden of maintenance, and I think they still take that position. So they've been kind to do the other phases, but we're sort of stuck with the maintenance side, and it's a very expensive endeavor. So anyway, this is one that we'll continue to face, but it's pretty urgent. We need a direction on where to go with this one, and I'm hoping we can buy a few more months out of OU at least until we can resolve the federal funding issue. This is a $6 to $8 million facility. By the time you get the facility built, all the parking, all the CNG, meeting all of our development standards, building stormwater detention, all the extension of water and sewer lines, the wash facility. Architects are working on sharpening their pencils, but it's probably a minimum $6 million construction package, and we are ready to bid. We've met our goal of getting this thing designed and ready. The council will act on this next Tuesday in terms of the zoning and plating, but we obviously can't go to bid until we get the funding in the bank.
Have we already started negotiations with the University of Oklahoma to see if there is any leeway?
We've had a couple of friendly conversations, and they've always been good sports with us all the way through this, and I'm sure they'll continue that. But I know that one of the vice presidents, Mr. Conrad, has plans on occupying this building with other operations at the university. So it's just a matter of time before they might need to do that. I suspect we always kind of thought, given our timing, that we weren't going to get this thing fully built and occupied by July 1st, so we suspected we'd have to be asking for a month or 2 or 3 extension. I don't think we expected to ask for 12 or 18 months extension, if that's what it comes to. So it's really a timing question.
Councilmember Carter?
So I'm thinking phasing. I'm also remembering that we were talking about 900,000, I think, for the maintenance facility building at one point, you know.
Cold storage, just that little building right there was about 900,000.
The yellow building?
Now, the 900,000 in the budget for EBT was this cold storage.
Oh, that was EBT.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so let's just say the next appropriations bills, timeline's not for a year. And then, you know, so we've got I mean, where are we gonna come up with $6 million? I mean, seems impossible.
Good question.
Selling the hospital land
Are we gonna,
is one way.
I mean, can we, I know juxtaposing, I remember in the budget, there's $1 million to buy new buses. Can we delay buying new buses a year, or is that a contractual thing we have to do?
If you ask us,
Yeah.
the fleet is desperate in need of replacement. So, if we had to choose between these two, we're gonna take bus replacements first, just because we've got to have those on lineup every morning.
Could we do a $6 million general obligation bond vote, like we did for the animal shelter, just for its own little thing?
We've started having those conversations with Anthony and Daryl. I mean, you've got maybe some debt financing built into your new sales tax funds. You could sell some debt and get that financed that way. Maybe you could take more out of Norman Forward, more out of PSST. I don't know. That was the purpose here, was to try to aggregate several functions into one place.
It's wonderful.
And use all those funds sort of together to make it more efficient. And, but again, Norman Forward
is there an idea to phase it, like, okay, we could do 3 million this year out of the budget and 3 million next year?
We're working on that. It's hard to do part of a building in
Well,
this
yeah, no,
case. So, but in terms of that, we've looked at maybe building the parking lots with city forces. We're working on that too. But there's sort of a bottom line to the building and the utilities and all that, and I think it's definitely in that $4 to $6 million range.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Councilmember Holman.
Just to be further clear on that, just the transit, just the yellow building alone and its bus parking is 6 to 8.
Yes, and all the
That's
other
not counting, so
all the other development, we wanted to, again, we're trying to be true to our development standards, so we need a building, a big detention basin here, all the parking, CNG extension, improvements to Da Vinci, landscaping, sewer line extensions, water line extensions, all development stuff.
how much are we looking at for everything in this picture?
Somewhere between 11 and 14 million.
Partly Norman Forward, PSST, and
Correct.
transit funding, all
Exactly.
three, for that whole number. But for just transit alone, we
correct.
need 6 to 8.
So you've got the same problem with your parks maintenance facility. That's located at Reeves. The Reeves Park project can't start until the maintenance facility moves out of Reeves. You've got $2 million budgeted for that facility. This estimate's coming in about 4.
PSST had assumed a facility of some kind, but there was $870K put aside as a line item, which gets us nowhere.
We budgeted $2 million for the parks building maintenance facility replacement, but it's actually coming in at $4 million.
Correct. So Norman Forward has $2 million set aside right now for that, but the cost estimates are about twice that. So you're short in both, but
MPSST is underwater.
correct.
Yeah. So PSST can't cover its share.
Because bonds that we sold.
Correct.
And the general fund is subsidizing the PSST right now anyway, to the tune of over $1 million a year.
All right, Councilmember Patron.
Well, I mean, I definitely not of the opinion that we just jump right in, even though, you know, basically everything that Councilmember Holman just said without knowing where this stuff's gonna come from. So I would say, what about, okay, if we put 2 million aside from Norman Forward, which is currently 3 million short already. What about the Parks Maintenance Fund for working on the parks facility?
You could certainly use some park development money for this, but the park development funds are in, 200,000 a year, not millions per year.
How much is in it?
That's what is in it. Remember, you
Balance
can't
of
use,
200,000?
the funds that are set aside for neighborhood parks can only be used in their neighborhood.
Okay.
But you could potentially use some of the community park money for this, and that's what I'm saying, it's in the hundreds of thousands that's available, not the millions.
Okay, and then I had some other questions here. So that was the Parks one. The Norman Forward, is this part of, I mean, does the 3 million short, that's just on projections, that's not taking into consideration of putting 2 million into a new building for Norman Forward out here?
The budget for the Reeves Park project included $2 million for a new park maintenance facility, wherever it may be. And what Sean is saying is that as they have done some more advanced engineering on what that building will cost, it costs more like $4 million when we have $2 million available in Norman Forward budgeted.
Okay, so that's coming out of baseball, softball's Reeves Park plan.
It was already in there for $2 million. That was part of the plan.
What about capital funds, like overall? I mean, can we not switch around what priorities are since we're capital budgeting as it is to, I mean, if this is, you know, the dire straits that we're talking about, maybe we go back and take a look at the 21 capital budget, and if these are the priorities, then I think that we should take this into consideration as part of the priorities, not just keeps, you know,
That's
just.
the deal.
Well, I mean, when we say where's it gonna come from, that's gonna be where it comes from. So, I mean, I think that we need to actually have that conversation, is what, in the
Unless we have
capital
a bond
budget, to where
issue.
we get this covered.
But there are limitations on redirecting money depending on how it was defended and that kind of stuff.
How many
But-
steps forward are we gonna take before we know how it's paid for, is my point.
Right. You have a capital budget discussion, I think, planned in about the third week in February, Brenda, somewhere in there. That's your big capital budget retreat on the FY21 budget, so you'll have a pretty good idea where you are on your capital in this year. Typically, there's about $1 million balance available to spend on other things each year.
What did you say that date was?
February 18th.
Okay, so I think that'll help to come up with that. If we're gonna prioritize this, I mean, I just don't understand the idea of continuing to spend money, you know, drawings and all of that stuff, if we don't know how we're gonna pay for it. And it sounds to me like that is of utmost importance right now, is that we need to prioritize this in the manner that you're speaking of. If this is more important than some of the other things, then we need to know, you know, from staff, which capital projects that can wait, you know, so that we can make up the money here, you know, prioritize this first.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Councilmember Carter?
Point of clarification, Anthony. I was under the impression by the end of Norman Forward, over the lifespan of Norman Forward, due to the changes in sales tax collection over time, that the projected income deficit was going to be $8 million.
Short of projections, yes.
Yeah, so we're looking at an $8 million Norman Forward income deficit by the end of Norman Forward.
Yeah, 3 million today.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful news. Let me just wrap up here. So, again,
If I may, you know, if council were saying, when we come forward with the February the 18th capital budget retreat, you would direct us to say, okay, well, let's see a proposal that we're not gonna do any stormwater projects next year, and we're not gonna pave any streets. How much could we raise for this? And that would be a good direction for us to work from.
many of those, as you know, are basic services. Many of those are public work services. A lot of your capital budget is in street maintenance and so on. So, or parks maintenance. So, again, fleet replacements is a huge priority challenge. We inherited a really old fleet, and we are struggling every day to keep it on the ground and moving. So that's built into this year's budget and next year's budget. And I really was serious. If you were asking us to make a choice, we need to replace buses, even if they're sitting out on a gravel lot somewhere. But that's what makes the system work. Taylor mentioned technology upgrades, whether it's synchromatics or the cameras or any number of things. We inherited a really old set of technology. When the university was cutting, they were cutting vehicles and technology, so we have to upgrade all that. We've talked about branding, and then we've talked about implementation of the fare structure. Just want to mention here, these are some of the things we've heard from council: service adjustments, restoring Saturday service, extending routes, a new transfer station. We could not agree with you more. Those are all things that we need to do. We just need time to stabilize and figure out where we're going. And we feel like a lot of that will be addressed in a more of a long-range planning process, along with your fare discussions, and of course, we want to increase ridership and technology. So this next slide is really what we would like to think that we're doing. We as a staff are doing. You tell us if we're on the right path here. But again, the next 6 months, finish that FTA documentation, get those program funds moving in our direction. Keep working with council on this fare discussion. Keep working on the bus maintenance facility. Get that 2020 budget in the bag and get the 2021 adopted with hopefully $1 million for fleet replacements. Taylor mentioned taking that long-range plan that you've already adopted and updating it, so we think that's really important. That'll give us direction on whether it's routes or stops or branding or whatever it is you want. That gets built into that plan, and we then have a plan moving forward to operate on. And again, developing and adopting those operating policies we mentioned that we have to get up to date. We mentioned a few here. Some of these are really critical, so we're working on those now. Some not as critical to the FTA.
So my question, and you and I had discussed this, I would like to see a timeline for those next 6 months of when we start having these public meetings, what locations, like, and I know that's going to be a lot of work, but it'll give us the feedback we need on, I mean, some policies are pretty cut and dry because they're what you have to have for the government, but then the routes, updating along, getting feedback on the fares. I mean, I would like to start having those sooner than later.
We would love to start this long-range planning process. Mayor, we just don't have any funding for it. If you'd like to direct us to do that, we'll go seeking funding in our programs. I think, frankly, we've been really focused on just the basics, and we don't know where the budget is going. So just like all of our other operations, we want to make sure that our budget is sound before we start spending that money. And we know you've got some budget challenges even this year. So, but if you want us to start that, we'd like to. I think it's going to take about $50,000 to $100,000 to hire a transit consultant to come in and do all those public meetings, have all those long-range planning exercises, and that would put you in a position to.
We're about to cut a consultant of $112,000 for a very important census, so I don't think it'd be responsible to do that. But could we start with ward meetings? Is that helpful, or would that derail the formal consulting process? I also don't want residents to feel like I'm giving this feedback and that's what I'm going to get because we don't have the funding for it. So that's where I'm kind of torn. But we also told residents we're going to get your feedback as we do this. So either are we just not going to do it until we have the funding?
You tell us. We think, again, there's a lot to think about. We've spent 2 hours just talking about branding and fare structure tonight. There's 100 other topics that we need to address, really. And that's why we think that long-range plan and getting an expert here to help us navigate through that. And yes, public input is really important, but we need to have something to offer them. And right now we have nothing to offer them in terms of what the questions are. So I really think the long-range planning process, like we did in 2014 with our comprehensive plan, is the way to go. And we'll try to do as much as we can. But again, you've got.
We just need to be patient.
I'm working about 10% of the time on transit, and Taylor's putting 100% of his hours in it. There's just not enough of us to go around.
Which I'll take that opportunity to mention. I know it's a lot of work and it can often be very stressful considering the funding issues, but you both are creating a legacy for the city of Norman that's going to be lasting in a very important area of what cities do that I think will only gain in importance. So please remember that when you're putting in all this time and effort, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you guys very much.
Councilmember Holman?
I was just going to mention that one of those avenues of public input is the Community Planning and Transportation Committee. We meet the fourth Thursday of every month at 4 p.m. here in this room. It's open to the public. Anybody can attend. And I most often take questions from the audience. And at least over the last 6 months, we've had transit riders at all of those committee meetings every month with questions about the paratransit service. That was especially during August and September and October. We had several here that had comments and questions, and it's been a pretty effective way, I think, at hearing about what's going on from people that are riding it every day, and then staff is able to address, questions, or I didn't think this was going, and we're able to sometimes even correct some misinformation about what we've been doing. So that's just one less formal than maybe than a having ward meetings, maybe more formal, I'm not sure, but that's a monthly opportunity where we get an update on our ridership reports, and we can ask questions about, I've been able to get benches put in at bus stops, stuff like that, just through CPT, saying, hey, could we get that done? And CART was always pretty good about addressing those types of issues when we brought them up. So that's just one for everybody listening, that I definitely encourage everybody to attend, council included, if you get a chance.
That's a great point, Councilmember, and I know that Councilor Bierman in Oversight is working on overhauling the boards and commissions, and I have lots of comments on that. One of the board/commission I would like to create is one on public transit. So would it be the right time to at least start creating that board or commission?
You have a public transit subcommittee right now of your ADA committee, and they're working, they met in December. They're working at least every 2 or 3 months on priorities. A lot of it has to do with accessibility, but they're also working on other public transportation interests.
I feel like maybe someone from the subcommittee would be an automatic member on a more community-wide public transit committee. But I also don't want to interfere with the process like we just discussed, but that would take time to advertise and get applications. And I would see that taking several months to fill, and they could give feedback on the timeline and hiring of any consultants should we get there. So I mean, I don't want to staff you to 2 different board or commission meetings, but I also want to make sure we're getting the input and involvement we need now that it's our bus system.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on moving forward with creating that board or commission?
You tell me, Mayor, we're happy to do whatever you wish. Again, staffing challenges, we're down an ADA coordinator, so I'm working over on that side right now, trying to keep those committees together, but if you give us some time, we should be able to put that together.
Councilmember Scott.
Sean, Taylor, Anthony, and Catherine, Ward 8 is having a ward meeting this weekend on Sunday. You're all welcome. I would love for you to come, talk about the budget, our crisis, this crisis. Catherine, I just want you there to explain certain things that may or may not come up about why we're experiencing such a crisis. And so if you guys can attend, I would really appreciate that, and we can discuss this. And there's our ward meeting.
What time on Sunday?
1:30 to 3 p.m. at Fire Station 7.
Oh, right next door to this.
Right next door. We can go on a walking tour.
Thank you.
It's probably too cold, sorry.
Councilmember Bierman.
So we are going to be having boards and commissions at our February oversight meeting, and I think that would be
Did I see that? Was that on the calendar?
March.
Yeah, I was
Never
like-
mind. Never mind. I was going to say having it at the February meeting would give these two maybe time to work through more of their FTA grant slog, taking a machete to that red tape, because one of the things we talked about was making it a slightly larger transit committee. And maybe folding in the bike advisory committee into that, and then really taking a holistic approach with bike lanes and sidewalks and public transit in whatever form it ends up looking like. So
That's fantastic.
I think that there's some real possibility there, and I know that Catherine's kind of working on that kind of already. So I think we already kind of have a ball rolling, so we can continue to push it down the slope.
Excellent. Any other comments? Lots of important work done tonight. Thank you all. With that, we will conclude this study session.
Good job.
Good luck, boys. Have fun.